Most of what we think we know about the ancient world is wrong, or at least incomplete. Hidden beneath jungles, submerged under oceans, and locked inside mountains are discoveries so strange, so quietly unsettling, that mainstream science has no comfortable answer for them. Not yet. Who built a perfectly engineered chamber thousands of years before the wheel was invented? Why does a map drawn in 1513 accurately show a coastline that wouldn't be officially explored for another 3 centuries? Tonight, let the mysteries come to you. Breathe slowly, get comfortable, and let's go somewhere history forgot. There is a place in northwestern Saudi Arabia where the land itself seems to have been arranged by someone or something with a purpose we no longer understand. It's called Harrat Khaybar, a vast volcanic field, ancient and scarred, stretching across hundreds of kilometers of black basalt rock. The ground here is dark and jagged, shaped by eruptions that date back thousands of years. It is, by most measures, one of the more inhospitable landscapes on Earth. No running water, no shade, no obvious reason for anyone to spend significant time here, let alone build. And yet someone did. From the ground, you might walk right past them. Piles of dark rock, low walls arranged in rough geometric shapes, scattered across the desert floor like forgotten afterthoughts. But from above, from a satellite or a plane or a drone camera hovering at altitude, the picture changes entirely. What emerges is staggering. Thousands of structures. Wheels, gates, kite shapes, and long processional avenues of stone, stretching across the volcanic landscape in formations that are clearly deliberate, clearly designed. Some are simple circles with spokes radiating outward like a wheel. Others are more complex, layered, asymmetrical, built with a spatial logic that archaeologists are only beginning to unravel. Many appear to align with specific astronomical points. Others seem to funnel or direct movement, like ancient corridors built for a procession or a purpose now lost to time. Researchers studying these formations have estimated that some of them may date back more than 9,000 years, placing their construction somewhere around 7,000 BC. That's older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older, in fact, than almost every monument we typically associate with the word civilization. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Who were these builders? The mainstream archaeological view suggests these structures were likely built by early pastoral communities, nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who moved across the Arabian Peninsula long before cities, writing, or recorded history existed in the region. The wheels, some scholars argue, may have been used in burial rituals. The kite-shaped formations were possibly hunting traps, designed to funnel animals toward a kill point. Practical, functional, grounded. But even within that explanation, questions remain. The sheer scale of these structures demands organized labor, coordination, some form of shared intention across a community large enough to move thousands of tons of volcanic rock across uneven terrain in extreme heat with no obvious technological advantage. That's not the work of a wandering family. That's the work of a society, one with hierarchy, planning, and a reason significant enough to justify enormous effort. And the astronomical alignments? Those are harder to explain away. Some researchers have noted that certain wheel structures appear oriented toward the rising sun at specific times of year, solstices, equinoxes. Others point to stellar alignments that would have been visible in the night sky thousands of years ago, but have since shifted due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis. If accurate, that suggests these builders weren't simply stacking rocks, they were watching the sky, mapping time, recording something. But recording what exactly? There are fringe theories, as there always are with sites like this. Some researchers operating outside mainstream academia have suggested the structures form part of a larger, interconnected network, a kind of ancient regional map or sacred landscape that stretches across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. A few have even drawn tentative comparisons to similar geoglyph traditions found in South America and Central Asia, raising quiet questions about cultural diffusion, shared knowledge, or parallel development across civilizations that, by all conventional timelines, should never have been in contact. No credible evidence has yet confirmed those connections, but the structures are real, the scale is real, and the silence of Harrat Khaybar, that wide, black, volcanic silence, holds its answers carefully. Whatever these people were doing out here, they wanted it to last. It has, and yet Harrat Khaybar is only the beginning. Because scattered across the same vast stretch of northwestern Saudi Arabia and spilling outward into the wider Arabian Peninsula, are structures even older, even more enigmatic, and, until very recently, almost entirely unknown to the outside world. They are called Mustatils. The word is simply Arabic for rectangles, and at first glance that description seems almost disappointingly plain. Rectangles, low walls of stacked stone, forming long, narrow enclosures on the desert floor. No roof, no obvious entrance, no decoration, no inscription, no artifact left behind to tell us who made them or why. But spend a little more time with them, and the plainness begins to dissolve. There are over 1,000 of them, possibly many more. They stretch across an area of roughly 200,000 square kilometers, a landscape so large it would comfortably contain the entire country of the United Kingdom. Some of these structures are modest in size. Others are extraordinary, running for over 600 meters in length, with walls still standing after what researchers now believe may be 7,000 years of exposure to wind, heat, and time. 7,000 years. Constructed, in other words, around 5000 BC. That places the Mustatils firmly in the Neolithic period, the Late Stone Age, a time when agriculture was only just beginning to take root in parts of the ancient world, when writing was still millennia away, and when the Arabian Peninsula itself looked very different from the arid wilderness it is today. Geologists and climate researchers have established that this region, during the period the Mustatils were built, was experiencing what is now called the African humid period, a climatic window when rainfall was higher, grasslands spread across the landscape, and lakes and rivers filled spaces that are now bone-dry desert. The Arabia of 5000 BC was, in patches, almost green. People lived here, animals moved through here, and someone, during that window of relative abundance, decided to build. The basic architecture of a Mustatil is consistent enough to suggest a shared design tradition. 2 short walls, called headers, anchor each end of the structure. 2 long walls connect them, running parallel across the desert floor. The interior is largely empty, but at one end, in many of the structures that have been excavated, archaeologists have discovered something unexpected: a small cell, a chamber of sorts, and inside that chamber, animal bones. Cattle, mostly, but also goat, gazelle, and in some cases, other species whose remains are fragmentary and harder to identify with certainty. The bones show signs of having been deliberately placed. Not discarded, not the remnants of a meal eaten nearby, but arranged, deposited with what appears to be intention. The working theory among the researchers who have studied these sites most closely is that the Mustatils were ritual enclosures, places of offering, perhaps the earliest known evidence of large-scale organized religion anywhere on Earth, predating the great temples of Mesopotamia, predating the ceremonial complexes of ancient Egypt, predating almost everything we typically associate with structured spiritual practice. That, in itself, is a profound and quietly staggering thought. These were not cities, not farms, not fortifications. They served no obvious practical function in the way a granary or a shelter does. They were built purely, or so the evidence suggests, for a purpose beyond survival. For something believed in, something honored, something that required effort, coordination, and the sacrifice of animals that, in that time and place, would have represented genuine wealth. But here is where the mainstream explanation, solid as it is, begins to leave certain things unaddressed. The sheer number of these structures implies a level of regional organization that is difficult to square with what we generally assume about Neolithic Arabian society. Building a single Mustatil requires moving significant quantities of stone. Building over 1,000 of them, spread across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, requires something more. A shared cultural framework, a common belief system, perhaps a network of communities in contact with one another across vast distances of landscape. Communities that, by conventional understanding, should have been small, dispersed, and largely isolated. How connected were these people really? Some researchers have begun to ask whether the Mustatils might form part of a larger sacred geography, a network of ritual sites deliberately positioned across the landscape, in relation to one another, to water sources, to ancient migration routes, or to features of the sky. A few of the structures do appear to share orientations that hint at astronomical awareness, though that work is still preliminary, and the field is cautious about drawing firm conclusions. Others have noted that the Mustatil tradition doesn't appear to exist in isolation. Similar long enclosure forms have been identified in other parts of the ancient world, in parts of the Levant, in regions of North Africa, raising quiet questions about whether what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia is a purely local development, or the visible edge of something far wider and more interconnected than our current maps of ancient history allow for. No consensus has been reached. The excavations are ongoing. The satellite imagery continues to reveal new structures in areas that haven't yet been visited on foot by any research team. There is a particular image that stays with you once you've spent time with this subject. A drone photograph taken at altitude over the northwestern desert, and in every direction, as far as the camera can see, the faint rectangular outlines of Mustatils stretch across the pale ground like messages written in a language we don't yet have the alphabet for. Thousands of them, patient, waiting, built by people who looked up at the same stars we see tonight, who felt something vast and unnameable moving through the world around them, and who responded the only way they knew how. They built something to hold it. Whether we will ever fully understand what they were reaching for remains for now an open question. There is something instinctive about going underground. Every culture, across every era of human history, has at some point turned to the earth itself for shelter, carving into rock, descending into darkness, building lives beneath the surface of the world above. It is one of our oldest impulses. Practical, yes, but also, in ways that are harder to articulate, deeply human. What was discovered beneath the city of Matiate in southeastern Turkey, however, goes far beyond anything that word shelter can comfortably contain. In 2020, during routine construction work in the Matiate district of Mardin province, workers broke through the surface and found themselves looking into something that should not, by any reasonable expectation, have been there. A tunnel, then another, then chambers, corridors, carved niches, ventilation shafts, and connecting passageways that extended outward in multiple directions beneath the modern city above. Archaeologists were called in, excavations began, and what slowly emerged from beneath the ground was not a cellar, not a catacomb, not a modest hiding place carved out in a season of danger. It was a city, an entire, functioning underground city, later identified through historical research as Matiate, a name that appears in ancient Syriac Christian texts as a place of refuge and habitation. Initial surveys suggested the complex covered an area of roughly 50,000 square meters. More recent assessments, as excavations have continued to push further into unexplored sections, have revised that figure significantly upward. Some researchers now believe the full extent of Matiate could be among the largest underground settlements ever discovered anywhere on Earth. The structure is extraordinary in its detail. The tunnels are carved directly into the soft limestone bedrock, a material that, while workable, still demands enormous patience and effort to shape by hand. The chambers vary in size, from narrow connecting passages barely wide enough for a single person to large open rooms that could have housed families, stored grain, sheltered animals. There are water cisterns carved with care to collect and hold rainwater filtering down from the surface. There are air shafts precisely positioned to draw fresh air deep into the underground network without revealing the location of the complex to anyone moving across the ground above. Whoever built this understood engineering. Whoever built this planned ahead. The mainstream historical interpretation places the primary occupation of Matiate in the early Christian period, roughly the 1st through 4th centuries AD, when communities of Syriac Christians in this region faced intermittent persecution and required places to retreat, hide, and survive. The underground city in this reading is a monument to resilience, a community that refused to disappear, carving its survival into the living rock, generation by generation. That explanation is well supported and historically coherent. The region was, during those centuries, a complex and often dangerous landscape, caught between competing empires, shifting allegiances, and waves of religious tension that made vulnerability a constant condition of daily life. Going underground, literally, was a rational response. But the deeper archaeologists descend into Matiate, the more the timeline begins to feel uncertain. Certain sections of the complex show construction techniques and stylistic features that sit awkwardly within the early Christian dating framework. The carving in some areas appears older, significantly older, and a number of researchers have begun to quietly raise the possibility that Matiate was not built from scratch in the early centuries AD, but rather expanded, modified, and reoccupied from a much earlier foundation. How much earlier is a question that current excavations have not yet resolved. This pattern, it should be noted, is not unique to Matiate. Across the Anatolian plateau of modern Turkey, there are dozens of underground cities, Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, Ozkonak, among others, that share the same basic architectural logic. Descending levels, ventilation systems, rolling stone doors designed to seal passages from the inside, water supplies, spaces for livestock, room in the largest of them for tens of thousands of people to live for extended periods entirely out of sight of the surface world. The question that haunts all of these sites, and Matiate perhaps most acutely, given its sheer scale, is not simply who built them, but what they were built in response to. Persecution explains shorter-term refuges, seasonal hiding places, temporary shelter during a known and finite period of danger. But the engineering investment required to build something like Matiate, the generations of labor, the sophisticated planning, the permanent infrastructure, suggests something more than a temporary solution to a temporary problem. It suggests a people who believed, on some fundamental level, that the surface world could not be trusted, that safety, real safety, existed only below. What were they afraid of? Some researchers have proposed climatic explanations, extended periods of instability, drought, or environmental disruption severe enough to drive communities underground for years at a time. Others have pointed to the recurring cycles of invasion and imperial violence that swept through Anatolia across millennia, suggesting the underground cities represent accumulated responses to threats that came in waves, each generation deepening and extending what the last had begun. A smaller number of voices, operating at the more speculative edge of the field, have suggested that some of these complexes predate any historical record we currently possess, that they were begun not in the early centuries AD, nor even in the classical period, but in a more remote antiquity whose nature we can only guess at. No firm evidence has yet placed Matiate's origins in that deeper past, but the excavations are less than a decade old. The tunnels continue. New chambers are still being uncovered, still being mapped, still yielding their quiet details to researchers who descend with lights and measuring tools into spaces that haven't felt human breath in centuries. Somewhere beneath the ordinary streets of a modern Turkish city, the rock remembers something. We are only just beginning to ask it the right questions. We have been underground long enough. Let us surface now, not into the desert, not into the volcanic fields of Arabia, but into something softer, greener. A landscape of rolling hills, thick jungle canopy and monsoon mist that settles over the valleys of northeastern India like a held breath. This is Assam, a state tucked into the far northeastern corner of India, bordered by Bhutan to the north, Myanmar to the east, and the dense, layered complexity of the surrounding hill regions in every other direction. It is a place of extraordinary biodiversity, of tea gardens and river plains, and ancient tribal traditions that stretch back further than written memory allows. It is also, as it turns out, a place that holds one of the most quietly puzzling archaeological mysteries in all of South Asia. Scattered across the Dima Hasao district of Assam, across hilltops and jungle clearings and terraced slopes that required significant effort to reach even today, are hundreds of giant stone jars. Not ceramic, not clay, stone, carved, each one, from a single block of rock, sandstone, granite, limestone, shaped into deep, open-mouthed cylinders that sit silent and largely unexplained across the forested landscape. Some are modest in size. Others stand over a meter tall and are wide enough that a grown adult could lower themselves inside with the room to spare. A number of them have lids, thick, heavy discs of carved stone resting across the openings, or lying nearby where time and gravity have displaced them. They sit in clusters. Some groupings contain a handful of jars, others contain dozens, and together across all the sites identified so far in the region, the total number runs into the hundreds, with researchers and local communities both suggesting that further exploration of the dense surrounding jungle would very likely reveal more. They have no inscription, no carving, no decorative element to offer even a starting point for cultural identification. They simply exist, sitting in the landscape with a kind of monumental patience, as if waiting for someone to remember what they were for. The local communities of the region, particularly the Dimasa people, whose ancestral connection to this landscape runs deep, carry oral traditions about the jars. One of the most commonly shared stories describes them as the drinking vessels of a race of giants, ancient beings of enormous stature, who once inhabited these hills and whose memory has softened, over generations, into legend. Another tradition speaks of a great king named Longraja, said to have used the jars to store rice beer for his armies as they moved through the region on campaigns of conquest. These stories are not evidence in the archaeological sense, but they are data of a different kind, traces of cultural memory reaching back toward an origin point that formal history has not yet located. What archaeology has established is this: the jars are genuinely ancient. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from and around the sites has placed their use, if not necessarily their creation, somewhere between roughly 900 BC and 1500 AD, a window that is frustratingly wide, and that researchers are continuing to narrow as new excavations provide better samples. Human remains have been found in association with several of the sites. fragments of bone, teeth, and in some cases, more complete skeletal material, suggesting that the jars played a role in funerary practice. Objects have been recovered nearby as well: iron tools, glass beads, ceramic fragments, evidence of a culture engaged in trade, in craft, in the broader material networks of the ancient world. The working interpretation among most archaeologists is that the jars functioned as part of a secondary burial tradition. In many cultures across Southeast and South Asia, the dead were not interred immediately and permanently. Instead, remains were processed in stages, sometimes exposed, sometimes kept in temporary containers, before final burial or deposition. The jars in this reading were vessels of transition, containers for the dead on their journey from one state of being to another. It is a coherent and culturally grounded explanation, and it may well be correct, but it leaves certain things unexplained. The effort required to carve these jars from single blocks of hard stone, using tools that, at the time of their likely creation, were made of iron at best, is considerable. The logistics of transporting them to hilltop sites across difficult jungle terrain adds another layer of complexity, and the absence of any obvious quarry sites near the jar locations raises a question that has not yet been satisfactorily answered. Where did the stone come from? How was it moved? And who, precisely, had the organizational capacity to undertake that kind of large-scale, sustained effort across what appears to have been a wide geographic region? The Assam jars are often overshadowed in popular discussion by their more famous cousins, the Plain of Jars in Laos, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has received considerably more international attention and research investment. The similarities between the two traditions are striking enough that some researchers have proposed a cultural connection, a shared practice, a shared belief system, perhaps even a shared origin, spreading across the ancient landscape of mainland and northeastern Asia in ways that conventional archaeological maps have not yet fully charted. Others caution against reading too much into surface similarities. Stone jars, they point out, are not an impossibly specific invention. Independent development, in broadly similar cultural contexts, is entirely plausible. The debate continues. The jungle holds its own council. And somewhere out there, beyond the edges of the sites currently known and mapped, the canopy closes over hilltops that no research team has yet climbed. Hills that local people sometimes speak of in passing. Hills where, they say, there are more jars, waiting, as they always have, in the green and patient dark. We leave the green hills of Assam behind now, the mist, the jungle canopy, the patient stone jars sitting in their quiet clearings, and we travel westward, back toward aridity, back toward open sky and ancient rock and landscapes that hold their secrets in plain sight, visible to anyone looking from the right angle. The right angle, in this case, means up. From the ground, you would see almost nothing remarkable. Low walls of stacked stone, barely knee-height in many places, running across the desert floor in what might appear to be random or meaningless directions. Easy to step over, easy to ignore, easy to walk past without a second thought, as people did for centuries, for millennia, in fact, before the age of aerial photography changed everything. Because from above, the picture resolves into something else entirely. Long, converging lines of stone, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters, occasionally for several kilometers, angling toward each other across the landscape, narrowing gradually until they meet at a point. And at that point, or clustered around it, a series of small enclosures, circular pits, stone-walled cells, carefully positioned to receive whatever the long arms of the structure were designed to funnel inward. From the air, the shape is unmistakable. Two long walls meeting at a head, with enclosures arranged around the convergence point like the tail of a kite caught in the wind. And so they were named, informally, by the Royal Air Force pilots who first noticed them during aerial surveys of the Middle East in the 1920s. Desert kites. They are found across an enormous geographic range, across the Arabian Peninsula, through Jordan, Syria, and into the Sinai and the southern reaches of Palestine. Some estimates put the total number of identified kite structures in the tens of thousands, though the true figure is almost certainly higher, given how much of the relevant landscape remains incompletely surveyed even today. They vary considerably in scale and design. Some are modest, simple, functional, built quickly and used once. Others are vast and architecturally complex, with multiple enclosure chambers, carefully angled approach walls, and evidence of repeated use and modification over long periods of time. The mainstream interpretation is well established and difficult to argue with on its basic terms. Desert kites were hunting structures. The long converging walls, sometimes called guiding walls or drivelines, were used to funnel herds of migrating animals, particularly gazelle and other cursorial species, toward the enclosed killing ground at the narrow end. Hunters, positioned along the walls or at the enclosures, would dispatch the animals once they were trapped and concentrated. It was, in essence, an ancient mass hunting technology, efficient, organized, and capable of yielding enormous quantities of meat, hide, and bone in a single operation. Evidence supports this. Animal bones recovered from kite enclosures across the region confirmed that gazelle were the primary target. The placement of many kite structures along known ancient migration corridors reinforces the interpretation, and the overall design logic, the funnel, the trap, the kill point, is elegantly consistent across thousands of individual examples spread across millions of square kilometers. But within that functional explanation, subtler questions have begun to surface. The oldest kite structures identified so far appear to date back as far as 9,000 years, placing their construction around 7,000 BC, deep in the Neolithic period, contemporaneous with the Mustatils we explored earlier and with the wheel structures of Harrat Khaybar. That antiquity is remarkable in itself, but what interests some researchers more than the age is the consistency. The fact that the basic design template of the desert kite remained recognizable and functional across an extraordinary span of time and geography, maintained and replicated by communities spread across a vast and varied landscape over the course of thousands of years. That kind of cultural persistence demands explanation. It implies transmission. Knowledge passed deliberately from generation to generation, community to community, across distances that were not trivial to cross on foot in the ancient world. It implies a shared understanding, a shared tradition, perhaps something approaching a shared identity among the peoples who built and used these structures. How connected, again, were these ancient desert communities? And how did that knowledge travel so far, so consistently and for so long? Some researchers have begun to look at the spatial distribution of kite structures not simply as a record of where animals migrated, but as a kind of map of human movement and interaction across the ancient landscape. The corridors between major kite concentrations, they suggest, may trace the routes along which people, ideas, materials, and beliefs moved through the prehistoric Middle East, a hidden infrastructure of relationship encoded in stone across the desert floor. Others have noted something that sits slightly outside the purely functional interpretation. A number of kite structures, when analyzed for their orientation and spatial positioning, appeared to reflect an awareness of landscape that goes beyond practical hunting logic. Certain examples are positioned on ridgelines or elevated ground where their visibility from a distance would have been significant, not for the animals being hunted, who would not have understood the geometry, but for the humans approaching from afar, as markers perhaps, as territorial signals, as monuments in some quiet sense to the people who built them and the landscape they called home. Were these structures ever more than hunting tools? Did they carry meaning beyond the purely practical? A claim on territory, a statement of presence, a message to others moving through the same ancient world? The stones do not say. They simply lie there, patient and low against the desert floor, their geometry invisible to anyone standing among them, their full design revealed only to those with the perspective to step back far enough and high enough to see the whole picture at once. Perhaps that is its own quiet lesson. Some things only make sense from a distance. There is a moment when you descend into the Serapeum of Saqqara, when the world above, the heat, the sand, the noise of modern Egypt simply ceases to exist. The stairway takes you down, the temperature drops, the light narrows, and then the tunnel opens before you. A long, straight, barrel-vaulted corridor carved directly into the bedrock of the Saqqara Plateau, extending into darkness in both directions with a geometry so precise, so deliberately proportioned that it feels less like a natural passage and more like something drawn first on paper and then transferred with extraordinary care into living stone. Along the walls of this corridor, set back into carved recesses at regular intervals, are the boxes. That word, boxes, feels almost insultingly inadequate. Each one is a sarcophagus, a container for the dead in the broadest sense, but the scale and the material push the word past its usual limits. These are not the gilded, painted, human-shaped coffins that most people picture when they think of ancient Egyptian burial. These are massive rectangular chests, each one carved from a single block of solid granite or basalt, some of the hardest stone available in the ancient world. Each one weighing on average somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. Some estimates place the heaviest examples closer to 120 tons. There are 24 of them, distributed along the main corridor and its branching side passages. 24 boxes of near impossible weight installed in chambers cut precisely to receive them, in a tunnel complex that runs for hundreds of meters beneath the desert plateau of Saqqara, just a few kilometers from the stepped pyramid of Djoser, one of the oldest monumental stone structures in human history. The Serapeum was rediscovered by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette in 1851, after centuries of being lost beneath drifting sand. Mariette had been led to the site, indirectly, by a passage in the ancient Greek writer Strabo, who described a sphinx-lined avenue leading to a temple buried by desert encroachment. Following the sphinxes, Mariette found the entrance, and what he found inside stopped him cold. The historical explanation for the Serapeum is grounded and well documented. The complex was used, from at least the reign of Amenhotep III in the 18th dynasty, roughly 1400 BC, through the Ptolemaic period, as a burial site for the Apis bulls. The Apis was one of the most sacred animals in the Egyptian religious tradition, a living bull believed to be the earthly manifestation of the god Ptah, later associated with Osiris in the form of Osiris Apis or Serapis. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified with extraordinary care and interred with full funerary honors in one of these colossal granite sarcophagi. A new bull, identified by specific sacred markings, would be chosen to continue the divine lineage. It is a coherent and historically supported explanation. Inscriptions found in the complex confirm the Apis connection. Votive objects, statues, and dedicatory stelae recovered from the site reinforce the religious context. The Serapeum was without question a sacred space of enormous significance in the Egyptian world. And yet, when Mariette entered the main corridor in 1851, he found something that has quietly unsettled researchers ever since. The majority of the sarcophagi were empty, not robbed in the conventional sense. The lids, each one weighing an estimated 30 tons or more, had been displaced or removed, suggesting deliberate opening rather than opportunistic looting. And inside most of the boxes, there was almost nothing. No mummy, no wrappings, no funerary objects of the kind that typically accompanied sacred burials of this importance. In one or two cases, fragmentary remains and a few objects were found. But the overwhelming picture was of chambers that had either been thoroughly cleared or, more puzzlingly, never fully used in the way the official narrative describes. Where are the Apis bulls? That question has not been satisfactorily answered, and it opens, almost immediately, onto a second and more technically demanding question, one that has occupied a particular subset of researchers, engineers, and archaeologists for decades. How were the sarcophagi made? Each box is carved from a single block of Aswan granite or basalt, materials quarried hundreds of kilometers from Saqqara and transported by whatever means to the site. The internal dimensions of each sarcophagus are finished to tolerances that modern metrologists, using precision instruments, have measured at fractions of a millimeter. The interior corners are sharp and consistent. The surfaces are flat to a degree that, in the modern world, requires precision grinding equipment to achieve. The lids fit with a closeness that, in some cases, approaches an airtight seal. The tools available to ancient Egyptian craftsmen, copper and bronze implements, stone abrasives, human labor, are not generally considered capable of producing this level of precision at this scale. That is not a fringe claim. It is a straightforward observation about the mechanical limitations of known ancient technology, and it is one that mainstream Egyptology has not fully resolved. Some researchers argue that our assumptions about ancient Egyptian tool capability are simply too conservative, that patient, skilled labor with abrasive techniques could, over sufficient time, achieve results we have underestimated. Others have proposed the use of lost technologies, advanced knowledge of acoustic or vibrational cutting methods, or the involvement of earlier and more technically sophisticated cultures whose contributions have not survived in the historical record. None of these explanations has been proven. None has been definitively ruled out. And so the sarcophagi sit in their tunnel, in their recesses, in their silent and perfectly proportioned chambers. 24 monuments to a capability we cannot fully explain, built for a purpose we cannot fully confirm, emptied by hands and for reasons we do not know. The corridor stretches away into darkness at both ends. And somewhere in that darkness, the granite holds its geometry with a precision that still, after all these years, has no entirely comfortable explanation. We surface again from the underground, from the granite darkness of Saqqara, from tunnels and sarcophagi and questions that precision itself cannot answer, and we return to the open air, to a landscape that on the surface appears almost ordinary. Almost. The region, known historically as the Acre Valley, sits in the northwestern corner of what is today the Palestinian coastal landscape, a fertile, anciently inhabited stretch of land where the Mediterranean coastline curves gently eastward, and the valleys of the interior open toward the hills of Galilee. It is a landscape that has known human presence for an almost unbroken stretch of recorded history. Settlements, ports, trade routes, armies, layer upon layer of human activity, each one pressing down upon the last, each one obscuring what came before. And yet, beneath all of that accumulated history, something older survived. In recent years, as satellite imaging technology has grown more refined and more widely accessible to archaeological researchers, analysts reviewing aerial and satellite data from the Acre region made a discovery that, in retrospect, seems almost too large to have remained unnoticed for so long. Spread across the landscape, partially obscured by modern agriculture, by later construction, by centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation, were the traces of enormous geometric figures. circles, lines, carefully arranged stone formations covering areas measured not in meters but in hundreds of meters, embedded in the agricultural and natural landscape like a signature written in a hand too large to read from ground level. Geoglyphs in Palestine. The term itself carries an immediate association with the famous Nazca lines of Peru, those vast figures etched into the desert plateau of South America that have captured the imagination of researchers and the public alike for nearly a century. The word simply means a large design or motif produced on the ground, typically using materials native to the landscape itself: stone, soil, removed vegetation, at a scale only fully perceptible from altitude. And that is precisely what the Acre Valley formations appear to be. The structures identified in the region vary in form. Some are simple stone circles, cairn-like arrangements of gathered rock forming rings that range from modest to impressively large in diameter. Others are more complex, elongated formations, linear arrangements, and multi-element configurations that suggest deliberate spatial planning rather than casual accumulation. Several of the larger formations incorporate features that align, at least approximately, with astronomical reference points. Solar orientations, lunar standstill positions, stellar alignments that would have been meaningful to communities living and farming in this landscape during specific periods of the ancient calendar. Dating these structures with precision is difficult. The Acre Valley, as noted, has been continuously inhabited and modified for millennia. Diagnostic material, the pottery, the organic matter, the stratified soil layers that archaeologists use to anchor dates, has been disturbed, displaced, and complicated by the sheer density of subsequent human activity in the region. Broad estimates place the construction of at least some of these formations in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods, roughly 4000 to 2000 BC, though certain elements may be older still, and the full chronological picture remains unresolved. The mainstream interpretation, where one has been formally advanced, tends toward the functional and the ceremonial. Stone circles and cairn fields in this part of the ancient Levant are generally associated with burial practices, territorial marking, or seasonal agricultural ritual. The landscape of ancient Palestine was densely organized around cycles of planting, harvest, and transhumance. The seasonal movement of communities and their animals between lowland and highland grazing territories, and monumental stone arrangements served multiple overlapping purposes within that way of life. They marked boundaries, they honored the dead, they oriented communities in time and space relative to the sky and the seasons. That framework is reasonable and well-grounded in the broader archaeological record of the region. But the scale of the Acre formations and their geometric regularity nudges certain researchers toward additional questions that the functional interpretation doesn't fully absorb. The precision of some of the larger circular formations, for instance, implies a surveying capability that goes beyond casual arrangement. To construct a circle of significant diameter with consistent geometry requires either a fixed central point and a measured radius, essentially a compass, scaled up, or a sophisticated understanding of spatial proportion that was deliberately applied. Either possibility speaks to a level of technical and organizational investment that suggests these were not minor, incidental constructions, but significant community undertakings with meaningful intent. And then there is the question of visibility. Like the desert kites of Arabia, like the Mustatils of the Hejaz, the full geometry of the Acre geoglyphs is not perceptible from the ground. You can stand inside one of these formations and see only the immediate arrangement of stones around you, with no sense of the larger pattern of which you are a part. The complete design, the circle, the alignment, the relationship between one element and the next, exists only at altitude, only from above. Who, then, was the intended audience for these designs? That question has threaded quietly through several of the sites we have visited on this journey. It is not a new question, and it does not have a comfortable answer. Some researchers invoke ritual and cosmological frameworks, the idea that designs made on Earth were understood as communications directed upward, toward sky, toward divine presence, toward whatever the builders understood to be watching from above. Others are more cautious, suggesting that the aerial perspective was simply an unintended consequence of large-scale ground-level design, never consciously considered by the builders themselves. Both positions are defensible. Neither is proven. What remains, in the Acre Valley, is a landscape that carries within it the quiet evidence of minds that thought geometrically, that organized space with intention, and that left their marks on the earth in forms large enough to outlast everything else they built or said or believed. The fields grow over them each season, and each season, from far enough above, the shapes remain. We have traveled far in this exploration. From the volcanic fields of Arabia to the tunnels beneath Turkey, from the jungle hills of Assam to the granite darkness of Egypt, from the geometric landscapes of Palestine to the open desert corridors of the ancient Middle East. Each site has offered its own particular quality of mystery, its own texture of the unexplained. Now we travel north, much further north, beyond the forests of western Russia, beyond the Ural Mountains where Europe quietly becomes Asia, beyond the great river systems that drain southward into the steppe. We arrive at a landscape that most of the world has never considered as a place of ancient complexity. A landscape of permafrost and Arctic wind, of frozen river bends and treeless horizons, where winter descends for months at a time, and the ground itself is locked hard as stone beneath a thin skin of seasonal thaw. This is Western Siberia, specifically the region near the modern city of Salakard, where the Ob River curves through the subarctic lowlands of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, a place whose name most people in the wider world could not locate on a map, and whose ancient history has, until relatively recently, received almost no international archaeological attention whatsoever. And yet, here, on a promontory above the frozen river, something extraordinary was happening 2,000 years ago. The site is called Ust-polui. It sits at the confluence of the Polui and Ob rivers, a position that would have been geographically significant to any community navigating these waterways in antiquity. A landmark, a meeting point, a place where routes converged and where the landscape itself seemed to pause and gather. Russian archaeologists first identified the site in the 1930s, excavated it sporadically over subsequent decades, and then, as fuller investigation resumed in the early 21st century, began to understand the true scale and strangeness of what had been left here. Ust-polui was a ritual complex, a place of ceremony, of sacrifice, of concentrated spiritual activity sustained over several centuries, broadly dated to between roughly 200 BC and 100 AD, placing it in the late Iron Age of the Western Siberian cultural sequence. The people who used this site were not urban, they were not literate. They left no written record, no inscribed monument, no named identity that has survived into the present. What they left instead was material, and the material, once excavated and analyzed, tells a story of remarkable intensity. The volume of animal remains recovered from Ust-polui is by any measure extraordinary. Thousands of bones, bear, reindeer, elk, wolf, dog, fox, and bird, species both common and rare, deposited across the site in quantities that far exceed anything associated with ordinary habitation or subsistence. Many of the bones show deliberate processing, cut marks, burning, breakage patterns that indicate intentional fragmentation rather than casual discard. Objects were found among them: iron and bronze implements, ornamental pieces of exceptional craftsmanship, belt fittings, figurines, decorative mounts, executed in an artistic tradition that researchers have connected to the broader Scythian and Western Siberian metalworking cultures of the period, traditions known for their sophisticated animal-style art and their complex cosmological symbolism. There were human remains as well. Not burials in the conventional sense, not graves with bodies laid out in the expectation of preservation and remembrance, but fragments, partial remains, intermixed with the animal bones and the objects in configurations that suggest the boundary between human and animal was understood very differently here than it is in most of the cultural frameworks modern observers bring to such sites. The working interpretation among the researchers who have studied Ust-polui most closely is that the site functioned as a major regional ceremonial center, a place to which communities from across a wide surrounding territory traveled, perhaps seasonally, to conduct collective rituals of sacrifice, feasting, and spiritual negotiation with the forces governing the natural world. The sheer quantity and variety of material deposited here suggests repeated, large-scale gatherings sustained over generations. It was not a private shrine or a local family sanctuary. It was something larger, a shared sacred space for a network of communities spread across the western Siberian landscape. That interpretation is grounded and archaeologically supported, but it raises questions that the evidence alone cannot resolve. The organizational demands of sustaining a major ritual center in the subarctic, coordinating the movement of communities across vast distances of difficult terrain, managing the logistics of large-scale animal sacrifice and feasting, maintaining the physical site itself over centuries, imply a level of social complexity and long-distance coordination that sits uneasily with conventional assumptions about the societies of this region and period. These were not, by the standard narratives, people with the infrastructure for that kind of sustained, large-scale organization. And yet, there it is. Some researchers have pointed to Ust-polui as evidence that the cultural and spiritual life of ancient Western Siberia was far more sophisticated, far more networked, and far more intentionally organized than the historical record has previously allowed. The connections suggested by the metalwork alone, stylistic parallels reaching westward into the Scythian world and eastward into the deeper interior of Asia, hint at a community not isolated at the edge of the known world, but embedded within it, connected, participating. Others have noted that the site's position on the river confluence was almost certainly not accidental. Across cultures and across millennia, the meeting of waters has carried spiritual significance, a liminal geography, a threshold between worlds, a place where the ordinary rules of the landscape were understood to thin and dissolve. Whatever was being communicated at Ust-polui, it was being communicated at a place the landscape itself seemed to designate as significant. The permafrost has preserved things here that would not have survived anywhere warmer. Organic materials, wooden objects, traces of structure and arrangement that the frozen ground held in suspension across 20 centuries, waiting for excavation tools and patient hands to bring them back into the light. What else the permafrost still holds, in the unexcavated portions of the site and in the surrounding landscape that has barely been surveyed, remains genuinely unknown. The river moves past in silence, as it always has, and the cold keeps its secrets with extraordinary fidelity. From the frozen river bend of western Siberia, we travel south and west now, trading permafrost for sand, Arctic silence for a different kind of stillness. The stillness of deep desert, of a landscape so ancient and so stripped of distraction that it forces the mind, eventually, toward a single focused question. How did we get here? Not here in any philosophical sense. Here, literally. To this canyon, this sandstone cliff face, this hidden hollow in the rock that sits in the heart of the Libyan desert, in the far southwestern corner of Egypt, one of the most remote and inhospitable stretches of the Sahara, where summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and where the nearest permanent water source lies hundreds of kilometers away. The place is called Wadi Sura. The cave within it has a name that stops people when they first hear it: the Cave of the Swimmers. It was brought to international attention in 1933 by the Hungarian explorer László Almásy, whose journey through the Egyptian desert in search of a legendary lost oasis led him, unexpectedly, to a sandstone cave whose walls were covered, floor to ceiling in places, with paintings. Hundreds of figures, rendered in ochre and other natural pigments, depicting human forms and postures that Almásy interpreted, immediately and unambiguously, as swimming. Arms extended forward, legs trailing behind, bodies horizontal in the universal attitude of someone moving through water, in the middle of the Sahara. Almásy's discovery became famous enough to inspire fiction, most notably the novel and subsequent film The English Patient, which used the cave as a central image of mystery and longing. But the academic questions the site raises are, in their quiet way, far more interesting than any fictional treatment. The paintings are genuinely ancient. Precise dating of rock art is technically challenging, but analysis of the pigments and stylistic comparison with other documented examples of Saharan prehistoric art place the Cave of the Swimmers images somewhere in the range of 8,000 to 10,000 years old, contemporary, roughly, with the Mustatils of Arabia and the earliest wheel structures of Harrat, Khaybar. 10,000 years ago, in other words, someone stood in this canyon and painted swimmers on the wall. The mainstream explanation is climatological, and it is both compelling and well supported by independent evidence. The Sahara, as it exists today, the vast, hyperarid desert barrier that stretches across the full width of northern Africa, is not the Sahara as it has always been. During the African humid period, that climatic window we encountered earlier in the Arabian Peninsula, the entire northern African region experienced dramatically increased rainfall. Lakes formed across what is now barren desert. Rivers flowed. Vegetation spread. Animals now found only in sub-Saharan Africa, hippopotamus, crocodile, elephant, giraffe, roamed landscapes that today support almost nothing. And people swam in lakes and rivers that filled the valleys and basins of what is now the Egyptian desert. In a world so thoroughly different from the present that the paintings, rather than being mysterious, become in this reading almost straightforwardly documentary, records of everyday life made by communities for whom water was not a rarity, but an ordinary feature of the landscape around them. That explanation accounts for the swimming figures. It is scientifically grounded and corroborated by geological, paleoclimatic, and paleontological evidence from across the region. The people of Wadi Sura were not painting fantasies, they were painting their world. But Wadi Sura does not stop at swimmers. The cave walls carry many other figures alongside the human swimmers, and some of those figures are considerably harder to explain within any straightforward documentary framework. There are headless humans. There are beings with animal characteristics. Elongated limbs, non-human proportions. Postures that suggest neither swimming nor any ordinary terrestrial activity. And then there are the figures that have attracted the most sustained and, in some cases, most contentious attention from researchers. Small, pale, round-headed beings with large eyes and spindly limbs, rendered in a style distinctly different from the other figures around them. Painted, apparently, by different hands or in a different tradition, and positioned on the cave wall in ways that suggest deliberate spatial separation from the more naturalistically rendered human forms nearby. These figures, sometimes called the Little People of Wadi Sura, or, more formally, the extraterrestrial style figures in the more speculative literature, have generated a body of interpretation that ranges from the carefully academic to the considerably more imaginative. The mainstream reading frames them as shamanistic or cosmological imagery, representations of spirit beings, supernatural entities, or figures encountered in altered states of consciousness, of the kind documented in rock art traditions across many ancient cultures worldwide. Shamanic practice, with its vocabulary of spirit helpers, animal guides, and non-human beings encountered in visionary states, provides a coherent cultural context for imagery that does not map onto ordinary physical reality. Others, operating further from the academic center, have proposed more literal interpretations, suggestions that the unusual figures represent genuine perceptions of non-human entities, whether understood through a spiritual or a more materially speculative lens. These interpretations exist, they circulate, and they are not, in honesty, entirely disconnected from the observable strangeness of the figures themselves. No consensus has formed around the unusual beings of Wadi Sura. The images resist resolution. What is certain is this: 10,000 years ago, in a landscape that no longer exists, a green, watered, inhabited Africa that the Sahara has swallowed whole, someone came to this canyon, mixed their pigments, raised their hands to the stone, and recorded something. Their world, their beliefs, their encounters, real or visionary, with beings and experiences that mattered enough to preserve. The canyon is silent now, the water is gone. The people who painted these walls left no other trace that has been found. Only the figures remain, suspended on the stone in postures of swimming, of flight, of something that has no name we are certain of. Reaching, it seems, toward a surface we cannot see. We leave the cave behind now, its painted walls, its vanished lake, its figures reaching toward a surface that no longer exists, and we cross an ocean. From the Sahara to the Pacific coast of South America, from ancient Africa to ancient Peru. The landscape changes entirely, from sandstone canyon to coastal desert, from ochre pigment to fitted stone. But something in the underlying question remains the same quiet insistence on looking upward, on watching the sky, on marking, with enormous effort and deliberate precision, the movement of light across the world. The Peruvian coastal desert is one of the driest places on Earth. A narrow strip of arid land caught between the cold Pacific to the west and the rising wall of the Andes to the east. It receives almost no rainfall and supports almost no vegetation. What it does receive, with extraordinary regularity and geometric precision, is sunlight. The sky here is clear for most of the year. The horizons are unobstructed, and the sun, rising and setting across those horizons in its slow annual cycle, traces a path that is both predictable and, to anyone watching carefully over generations, deeply meaningful. Someone was watching carefully here a very long time ago. The site is called Chankillo. It sits in the Casmasechin Basin of the Ancash region of coastal Peru, roughly 365 kilometers north of Lima. A name, incidentally, that carries an almost pointed numerical resonance for a site whose purpose turns out to be intimately connected with the counting of days. The complex as a whole is substantial and multi-component. A large, ceremonial and possibly defensive structure occupies a hilltop at its center, surrounded by walls and bastions that archaeologists have debated for years, uncertain whether to classify the site primarily as a fortress, a temple, or something that blurs the boundary between those categories entirely. But the feature that has drawn the most sustained international attention sits just to the east of the main complex, running along the crest of a low, elongated hill. 13 towers, evenly spaced, consistently proportioned. Built from stone and adobe in a row that stretches for roughly 300 meters along the ridgeline, each tower separated from its neighbors by a gap of carefully calibrated width, each one positioned with a specificity that, once its purpose was understood, reframed everything else about the site. From 2 observation points, one to the east of the Tower Row, one to the west, the 13 towers function as a solar calendar of extraordinary precision. As the sun rises and sets throughout the year, its position on the horizon shifts gradually northward and southward in the well-known annual cycle. The towers of Chankillo are positioned so that, viewed from the designated observation points, the rising or setting sun aligns with different gaps and edges in the Tower Row at different times of year, tracking the solar cycle across its full annual range, from solstice to solstice and back again, with a precision that researchers have calculated at an accuracy of 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days, using stone towers, naked eye observation, and an understanding of solar geometry that was, by any measure, sophisticated. The site has been dated to approximately 300 to 200 BC, the late initial period or early horizon of Peruvian prehistory, a time of significant cultural development along the Peruvian coast that predates the more widely known civilizations of the region, including the Inca, by well over 1,000 years. The builders of Chankillo are not definitively identified. They left no written record. The complex itself shows evidence of deliberate destruction at some point in its history. Burning, demolition, the systematic dismantling of elements that someone, for reasons unknown, wanted removed or neutralized. The mainstream interpretation of Chankillo as a solar observatory is now broadly accepted among researchers. A rare convergence of architectural analysis, astronomical modeling, and field observation that has produced something close to scientific consensus. The towers work. Their function has been demonstrated with a clarity that leaves little room for doubt about their primary purpose. But consensus about the what does not resolve questions about the why and the who. A solar calendar of this precision, requiring generations of careful observation to design and substantial organized labor to construct, implies an institution, a body of knowledge held and transmitted by specialists, a community with enough stability and enough surplus to invest in infrastructure, whose primary return was not agricultural yield or physical protection, but information. The knowledge of where, exactly, in the year a given day fell. Why did that matter so much? In agricultural societies, the answer seems obvious. Planting and harvest cycles depend on seasonal timing. But the precision of Chankillo goes considerably beyond what basic agriculture requires. A 2 to 3 day accuracy in tracking the solar year is the kind of precision that serves more refined purposes. The scheduling of ceremonies, the regulation of ritual calendars, the coordination of events across a wider network of communities for whom shared temporal reference was socially and politically significant. Some researchers have suggested that Chankillo functioned not merely as an observatory, but as a demonstration, a monumental, permanent, publicly visible proof of an institution's ability to know and control time itself. In many ancient cultures, the capacity to predict celestial events was a form of power, a way of mediating between the human world and the cosmic order, of positioning particular individuals or institutions as indispensable bridges between earth and sky. If that is what Chankillo represented, then the burning and demolition it apparently suffered takes on a different quality. Not random destruction, perhaps deliberate erasure. Someone at some point wanted this particular calendar, and perhaps the authority it embodied, to stop working. What that conflict was, who was on each side of it, and what was ultimately at stake in the destruction of a solar observatory on a Peruvian ridgeline 2,000 years ago, these questions have no answer that the stones, patient and partial as they are, have yet provided. The towers still stand mostly, the sun still moves across the horizon in its ancient, indifferent arc, and twice a year, at the solstices, the alignment still works. Light falling exactly where it was designed to fall, marking a moment in time for an audience that no longer exists, or perhaps simply waiting for one that does. The Towers of Chankillo have shown us something important: that the impulse to mark time, to fix the movement of the sky in permanent stone, to make the invisible architecture of the cosmos legible and repeatable, is not the property of any single culture or any single continent. It appears, independently and insistently, across the ancient world, in landscapes separated by oceans and millennia, in communities that could not possibly have been in direct contact with one another. It is perhaps one of the most deeply human impulses of all: the need to know where we are in the year, the need to locate ourselves in the turning of things larger than ourselves. We carry that thought with us now as we travel back eastward, back across the ocean, back across the equator, back toward the ancient world of the Middle East, but this time to a corner of it that receives almost no attention in the popular literature of archaeological mystery. A place so quietly extraordinary that even specialists working in adjacent fields are sometimes unaware of its existence. We are going to Kuwait, specifically to the flat, arid coastal plain of As-sabiyah, in the far northeastern corner of Kuwait, where the desert meets the upper waters of the Arabian Gulf. It is not, at first consideration, a landscape that invites superlatives. The terrain is low and featureless by the standards of the region. No dramatic volcanic fields, no towering cliffs, no obvious geographical drama to signal that something significant happened here. The ground is pale and stony. The horizon is wide and unbroken. The heat, for most of the year, is absolute. And yet this unremarkable-looking stretch of coastal desert turns out to contain some of the most important and least understood archaeological evidence in the entire Arabian Peninsula. The story of As-sabiyah as an archaeological site begins, formally, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when joint Kuwaiti and British research teams began systematic survey work across the region. What they found, gradually and with accumulating astonishment, was a landscape saturated with human activity stretching back across an enormous span of time. Prehistoric shell middens, lithic scatters, concentrations of flint tools and debitage left by communities working stone for cutting and hunting implements, traces of structures, hearths, and occupation surfaces pressed into the desert floor at multiple stratified levels, each one representing a different period of habitation by communities whose names and languages are entirely unknown to us. But the feature of As-sabiyah that has generated the most sustained research attention and the most unresolved questions is something more specific and more visually striking than scattered flint. Across the desert surface of the As-sabiyah Peninsula, researchers have documented extensive networks of stone structures. Low walls, enclosures, platform mounds, and what appear to be the degraded remains of more substantial buildings, all constructed from the local limestone and flint cobbles available in the immediate landscape, all arranged across the terrain in patterns that speak, however quietly, of deliberate organization. Some of these structures are clearly domestic in character, the traces of habitation, of communities that camped or settled here during periods when the environment was productive enough to support them. Others are more ambiguous, their function resisting easy classification. Among the most intriguing features documented in the As-sabiyah landscape are a series of what researchers have described as platform or mound structures, raised areas of deliberately accumulated stone and earth that do not correspond neatly to any obvious domestic or agricultural function. They are not large by the standards of monumental architecture elsewhere in the ancient world. But in the context of a coastal desert landscape, where the construction of any permanent stone structure requires effort and intention, their presence is noteworthy. The chronological picture at As-sabiyah is complex and still being assembled. occupation of the site spans an extraordinary range, from the Ubaid period, roughly 5,500 to 4,000 BC, through the subsequent Chalcolithic and Bronze Age phases, with evidence of activity continuing into the historic period. That Ubaid connection is particularly significant. The Ubaid culture, centered on the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia in what is now southern Iraq, represents one of the earliest complex societies in human history, a pre-urban but highly organized cultural tradition that spread its influence, through trade and migration, across an enormous geographic area including the Arabian Gulf coastline. As-sabiyah has produced Ubaid period pottery in quantities and conditions that have substantially revised scholarly understanding of how far the Ubaid cultural network extended and how it operated. The site appears to have functioned during the Ubaid period as a significant node in a maritime trading system that connected the river plains of Mesopotamia with communities along the Gulf Coast, an ancient commercial and cultural corridor whose full extent and sophistication earlier generations of researchers had significantly underestimated. That is the established picture. Solid, well-evidenced, academically grounded. But the stone landscape of As-sabiyah contains elements that the trading post framework does not fully accommodate. The density and variety of the structural remains across the site suggest a level of sustained, multi-generational investment in this particular location that goes beyond what a seasonal trading station or temporary camp would require. Communities were not simply passing through As-sabiyah, they were returning to it, building in it, modifying and extending what earlier occupants had left, across a span of time measured not in years but in millennia. Something about this place held them. What that something was remains genuinely unclear. The coastal position is clearly significant. Access to marine resources, to Gulf trade routes, to the prevailing wind patterns that governed ancient seafaring in the region. But some researchers have suggested that the site may have carried additional significance of a less purely practical kind. The arrangement of certain structural elements across the landscape, and their relationship to one another and to the surrounding topography, has led a small number of investigators to propose that As-sabiyah may have functioned, at certain periods, as a ceremonial or gathering site as well as a habitation, a place where communities from across the wider region converged for purposes that extended beyond trade into ritual, social bonding, and the collective renewal of shared cultural identity. The evidence for this is suggestive rather than conclusive. The excavations at As-sabiyah have been limited relative to the full extent of the site. Large portions of the landscape remain unsurveyed at the resolution required to answer the questions the initial work has raised. What lies beneath the undisturbed sections of the As-sabiyah desert? What structures? What deposits? What accumulated evidence of human meaning-making across 6,000 years of return and rebuilding remains, in the most literal sense, underground? The pale stones lie still in the Gulf heat. The water that once moved through ancient trading networks laps at the same shoreline it always has, and somewhere beneath the unremarkable surface of this quiet Kuwaiti plain, the ground holds a record of human presence so long and so layered that we have, as yet, barely learned to read its opening lines. There is something the ancient world understood about stone that we have largely forgotten, not merely its practicality, its durability, its abundance, its resistance to the forces that consume softer materials over time. Something deeper than that. Something about the relationship between stone and permanence, between the act of cutting into rock and the act of making a claim on eternity. Across every culture we have visited on this journey, from the granite sarcophagi of Saqqara to the carved tunnels of Matiate, from the sandstone hollows of Wadi Sura to the fitted towers of Chankillo, the same instinct recurs. When something mattered, truly, lastingly mattered, people reached for stone, and nowhere is that instinct more quietly, more persistently evident than in the ancient practice of cutting directly into living rock to house the dead. We remain in the Arabian Peninsula now. We move northward from the coastal plains of Kuwait, back into the interior of Saudi Arabia, into a region of the country that has only recently begun to receive the archaeological attention it has long deserved. The landscape here is different from the volcanic fields of Harrat, Khaybar, or the open desert corridors of the Mustatil country. This is sandstone terrain, warm-colored, layered, sculpted by millennia of wind erosion into escarpments and cliff faces, and rocky outcrops that rise from the desert floor with a dramatic, almost architectural quality. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of landscape that invites people to cut into it. The region of Al-Hayt sits in the Hiyal province of northwestern Saudi Arabia, a name that will be unfamiliar to most people outside the country, and even to many within it. It is not Petra, whose rose-red facades have made rock-cut architecture famous across the modern world. It is not Hegra, the Nabatean city of monumental tombs that has recently opened to international tourism and begun to receive the recognition it warrants. Al-Hayt is quieter than both. Less visited, less documented, less integrated into the global conversation about ancient Arabian heritage. But the tombs it contains are remarkable. Carved directly into the sandstone cliff faces and rocky outcrops of the Al-Hayt landscape, the rock-cut tombs of this region represent a funerary tradition of considerable antiquity and complexity. They vary in form. Some are simple chambers cut horizontally into the rock face, their entrances sealed or open depending on the degree of subsequent disturbance. Others are more architecturally elaborate, with carved facades, internal niches, and spatial arrangements that reflect deliberate planning and an investment of skilled labor that goes well beyond the minimum required to simply house a body in stone. The tombs are not isolated features, they cluster. They concentrate along particular cliff faces and escarpments in groupings that suggest organized, community-level funerary planning rather than individual or ad hoc construction. Certain locations appear to have been chosen and returned to repeatedly across extended periods, accumulating tombs across generations, building up a presence of the dead in the landscape that was clearly intended to be visible, legible, and permanent. Dating the Al-Hayt tombs with precision is complicated by the limited excavation work conducted at the site to date. The broader rock-cut tomb tradition in northwestern Saudi Arabia spans a very wide chronological range, from the late prehistoric period through the pre-Islamic historic era, encompassing cultural phases associated with the ancient Didanite and Lihianite kingdoms centered further south at Al-Ula, as well as later Nabatean influence that spread northward through the Hejaz along ancient trade routes. Where the Al-Hayt tombs fall within that sequence, and which cultural tradition or traditions produced them, are questions that current research has not yet definitively resolved. What the tombs have yielded, in the limited investigation conducted so far, is fragmentary but suggestive. Human remains, as expected, though often disturbed by centuries of subsequent activity and environmental exposure. Ceramic material that gestures toward chronological placement without yet providing firm anchors. And occasionally, traces of material culture, objects, ornaments, the residue of funerary practice that hint at the beliefs and social structures of the communities that carved these chambers and placed their dead within them. The mainstream interpretation frames the Al-Hayt tombs within the well-established context of Arabian funerary traditions, communities that invested in elaborate and permanent burial architecture as a way of asserting ancestral connection to territory, of maintaining social memory across generations, and of navigating the theological or cosmological demands of their particular understanding of death and what follows it. Rock-cut tombs in this reading are statements, claims. The dead, housed in stone, continued to anchor the living to the land. That interpretation is archaeologically sound and culturally coherent. But it leaves certain spatial questions unanswered. The selection of specific cliff faces and outcrops for tomb construction, the choice of this particular rock, this particular orientation, this particular position in the landscape, was never arbitrary in ancient funerary traditions. Placement mattered. The relationship of the tomb to the surrounding landscape, to water sources, to travel routes, to the rising and setting of significant celestial bodies. These were considerations that shaped funerary geography across the ancient Arabian world with a consistency that suggests shared cosmological principles operating across wide distances and long time periods. Some researchers studying the spatial distribution of rock-cut tombs across northwestern Saudi Arabia have noted patterns in their positioning that appear to reflect deliberate landscape organization. Tombs placed at intervals along routes, oriented toward particular horizon features, arranged in visual relationship to one another across distances that imply a planned, regional scale conception of sacred space, rather than simply local decision-making about convenient cliff faces. Whether Al-Hayat participates in such a larger pattern, whether its tombs are nodes in a wider network of funerary landscape that once structured movement, memory, and meaning across the ancient Hijaz, is a question that current research is only beginning to formulate, let alone answer. The sandstone holds its color beautifully in the afternoon light, that warm, reddish gold tone that makes the rock faces of northwestern Arabia look, at certain hours, almost luminous, as if the stone itself were generating light rather than simply reflecting it. The tomb entrances face outward across the desert. They have faced outward for centuries, for millennia, watching the landscape change around them while they themselves remained fixed and patient in the cliff. Whatever was placed inside them, whatever was believed about what happened after the stone sealed closed, that knowledge belongs to the people who carved these chambers, and those people are gone, leaving only the geometry of their grief and their faith pressed permanently into the living rock. Somewhere in the unexcavated tombs of Al-Hayat, in chambers that no modern hand has yet opened, the geometry still waits. Silent, sealed, holding whatever it was given to hold. The tombs of Al-Hayat have reminded us of something we have encountered again and again on this journey, that the dead in the ancient world were never simply gone, they were placed, positioned, given permanent addresses in the landscape, housed in structures whose orientation, whose materiality, whose relationship to the living world around them was carefully, deliberately considered. The dead were neighbors, ancestors, presences whose continued existence in stone or earth or carved rock shaped the way the living moved through, understood, and claimed the world they shared. We carry that thought southward now, down through the Arabian Peninsula, across the Gulf of Aden, into the Horn of Africa, and then inland, into the high plateau of Ethiopia, where the air is cooler and thinner than the coastal lowlands, where the landscape opens into wide grassy plains, interrupted by volcanic hills and ancient river valleys, and where, in a field roughly 160 kilometers south of Addis Ababa, something stands that has puzzled archaeologists, historians, and careful observers for as long as the outside world has been aware of it. The site is called Tiya, and it is, in the most immediate visual sense, one of the strangest landscapes in all of Africa. Imagine standing at the edge of a flat, open field in the Ethiopian highlands. The grass is green, the sky wide, the surrounding landscape agricultural and lived in. A working rural environment that has been farmed and grazed and inhabited continuously for centuries. And rising from that ordinary field, in a rough double row extending across the ground, are the stelae, 36 of them. Tall, narrow, blade-like standing stones of varying heights, the tallest reaching over 5 meters above the ground, planted upright in the earth with a regularity that is clearly intentional and an individuality of form that is immediately striking. They are not plain, they are carved. Each one bears incised decoration on its surface. Symbols, figures, geometric elements rendered with a consistency that speaks of a shared artistic tradition, a shared symbolic vocabulary, deployed across the entire field of stones with deliberate and meaningful variation. Tiya was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980. That designation reflects both its archaeological significance and the fragility of its preservation. The stelae are sandstone, relatively soft, and the carved surfaces that define their meaning are vulnerable to erosion, to weathering, to the slow damage of exposure that no designation alone can fully arrest. The symbols carved into the Tiya stelae are, collectively, among the most discussed and least resolved elements of the site. Several recurring motifs dominate. A sword or dagger figure appears on many of the stones, rendered in a stylized but consistent form, blade pointing downward, in a configuration that most researchers interpret as funerary in significance. Alongside the sword, on some stones, are figures that appear to represent the human form in abstracted or schematic terms. Stylized bodies, sometimes with suggested limbs or facial features, positioned in ways that may indicate status, identity, or the circumstances of death. And then there are the symbols that resist easy classification. Geometric forms, interlocking shapes, repeated patterns, configurations that have no obvious parallel in the better documented symbolic systems of the ancient world. They are not random. Their placement on specific stones, in specific positions relative to other carved elements, is too consistent to be accidental. They mean something. What they mean is a question that scholarship has circled for decades without arriving at a settled answer. The archaeological context of Tiya connects it to a broader and fascinating cultural phenomenon of the Ethiopian highlands, the stele field tradition associated with the ancient Sidama culture, a pre-Christian, pre-Islamic population whose presence in southern Ethiopia predates the better-known civilizations of the northern highlands by an uncertain but significant margin. The Sidama stele fields are distributed across a wide area of southern Ethiopia, with Tiya being the largest and most intact single site, and they are almost universally associated with burial. Excavations at Tiya and related sites have confirmed the presence of human remains beneath and around the standing stones. Multiple individuals in some cases, interred in crouched positions with grave goods that include ceramics, iron objects, and personal ornaments. The mainstream dating places the Tiya stele within a range of roughly 1000 to 1500 AD, the medieval period in global terms, which sometimes surprises people who encounter the site expecting something more remote in time. But that dating, while reasonably well supported by the associated material culture, applies specifically to the period of most intensive use documented archaeologically. Whether the tradition of erecting stele in this landscape and the symbolic system encoded in their carvings began earlier, perhaps significantly earlier, is a question that the evidence has not yet cleanly resolved. Some researchers have noted that certain elements of the Tiya symbolic vocabulary bear intriguing resemblances to carved traditions documented at other ancient sites across the broader East African and Horn of Africa region, resemblances that may indicate cultural continuity, shared origin, or networks of influence operating across the ancient landscape of the continent, in ways that conventional historical narratives have underrepresented. Others have pointed to possible connections with ancient South Arabian symbolic traditions across the Red Sea, a cultural corridor that was genuinely active in antiquity, with populations, languages and material traditions moving in both directions across that narrow body of water throughout the ancient and medieval periods. These connections are suggestive and contested in equal measure. The field of Ethiopian archaeology, relative to its extraordinary richness, remains significantly under-resourced and incompletely surveyed. Large portions of the southern highlands, where steely fields are known or suspected to exist, have never been systematically investigated. The full distribution of the tradition, how many sites there are, how they relate to one another spatially and chronologically, what the complete range of symbolic variation across all known examples might reveal about the culture that produced them, remains genuinely unknown. There is a quality to the Tiya field, in photographs and in the accounts of those who have visited it, that transcends the purely archaeological. Something about the scale of the stones relative to the human body. Something about the way they rise from an otherwise ordinary agricultural landscape, without warning, without context, without any surviving structure or text or tradition to fully explain them. They stand in their rows, blade symbols facing the same direction across the field, as if oriented toward something, a direction, a presence, a point of significance in the landscape or the sky that made this particular alignment meaningful to the people who planted them here, one by one, over what must have been generations of return and remembrance. The grass grows around their bases as it always has. The highland wind moves across the carved surfaces, tracing the same symbols that unknown hands pressed into the stone centuries ago, and whatever those symbols were meant to say, to the living who stood here, to the dead who lay beneath, to whatever else the builders understood to be listening, that meaning remains for now their own. The stelae of Tiya have left us with a particular image: stones standing upright in a field, planted by human hands with deliberate intention, arranged in rows that speak of organized thought, of shared belief, of a community's need to mark something permanent in an impermanent world. That image, the standing stone, the upright marker, the vertical claim made in rock against the horizontal pull of time, is one of the oldest and most widely distributed expressions of human culture on the planet. And nowhere is that expression more astonishing in its sheer scale and density than in a region of West Africa that most of the world passes over entirely when it thinks about ancient monuments. We travel westward now, across the Ethiopian highlands, across the width of the African continent, to the Atlantic coast, to the flat, warm, river-threaded lowlands of Senegambia. The region that encompasses the modern nations of Senegal and the Gambia, pressed together along the course of the Gambia River as it winds westward toward the sea. It is a landscape of laterite soil and savanna woodland, of seasonal rains and wide river bends, of villages and agricultural land that has been continuously inhabited and worked for longer than the available historical record can fully trace, and distributed across roughly 100 kilometers of this landscape, in 4 major groupings centered on the sites of Sinanayen, Wanar, Wasu, and Kerbach, are over 1,000 stone circles. 1,000 stone circles. Constructed from laterite pillars, cylindrical or lyre-shaped columns of the local ironstone, quarried from nearby outcrops, shaped and transported to their sites, and planted upright in the earth in rings of between 8 and 14 stones each. The circles range in diameter from roughly 4 to 7 meters. The individual pillars range in height from 1 to 2.5 meters, and in weight from 1 to 10 tons. Some have a distinctive double circle arrangement, an inner ring nested within an outer one, separated by a carefully maintained spatial interval. The total number of individual standing stones across all 4 site groupings runs into the thousands. It is, by any measure, one of the largest concentrations of megalithic monuments anywhere on Earth. And it is, by the standards of global archaeological awareness, almost entirely unknown outside specialist circles and the communities of the immediate region. UNESCO recognized the Senegambian stone circles as a World Heritage Site in 2006, citing their outstanding universal value and the remarkable consistency of the tradition across such a wide geographic area. That recognition has done something to raise the profile of the sites internationally, but they remain in the popular imagination of ancient mysteries, vastly overshadowed by monuments. Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, the Nazca lines, that have benefited from centuries of Western archaeological attention and the cultural infrastructure that tends to follow it. The mainstream archaeological understanding of the Senegambian circles is grounded primarily in excavation evidence from within and around the monuments. Beneath and adjacent to many of the circles, human burials have been found. Sometimes single individuals, sometimes multiple burials accumulated over time, interred with ceramic vessels, iron objects, and personal ornaments that provide both chronological anchoring and cultural context. The broadly accepted dating places the construction and use of the circles between roughly 300 BC and 1600 AD, a span of nearly 2,000 years during which the tradition was maintained, extended, and practiced across the region with a remarkable consistency of form. That 2,000-year span is itself one of the most striking features of the Senegambian phenomenon. Traditions change, cultures evolve, fragment, absorb external influences, respond to environmental and social pressures in ways that typically alter material culture significantly over such extended time periods. And yet, the stone circle tradition of this region persisted, recognizably, consistently, across a span of time longer than the entire history of Christianity. Something held it together. Some institutional, social, or spiritual continuity maintained the knowledge of how to quarry, shape, transport, and erect these monuments and the understanding of why doing so mattered across 80 or more human generations. What was that continuity? What was the tradition that held? The association with burial is clear and archaeologically secure. The circles were, at minimum, funerary monuments, markers for the dead, organizing the landscape of the living around the presence and memory of those who had passed. In many African cultural traditions, the relationship between the living and ancestral dead is not the arm's-length commemorative relationship that characterizes most modern Western funerary practice. The dead remain active participants in community life, sources of guidance, protection, and authority, whose proper acknowledgement is not optional but essential to social and cosmological order. The circles in this context were not merely graves. They were addresses, places where the living could locate and engage with the ancestral dead in an ongoing relationship of mutual obligation and communication. That interpretive framework, deeply rooted in West African cultural tradition and entirely coherent with the material evidence, goes a considerable way toward explaining not just what the circles were, but why the tradition persisted so stubbornly across so many centuries. When the dead are genuinely present in the landscape, when their continued acknowledgement is understood as necessary to the well-being of the living, the incentive to maintain the tradition that houses and honors them is not merely cultural sentiment. It is existential necessity. But even within that framework, certain questions accumulate. The scale of the enterprise, the quarrying of laterite pillars across a 100-kilometer landscape, the organized labor required to shape and transport stones weighing up to 10 tons, the spatial planning implicit in the consistent geometry of the circles across thousands of individual examples, implies a level of regional coordination that is difficult to attribute to purely local, village-level organization. Someone, or some institution, was overseeing a tradition that operated simultaneously across a very wide geographic area, maintaining standards of construction and spatial arrangement that remained recognizable across centuries and across the full extent of the tradition's distribution. What was that organizing institution? Was it political? A network of chieftaincy or regional authority that enforced and perpetuated the tradition as a form of territorial and social control? Was it religious? A priestly or ritual specialist class whose knowledge and authority extended across the region and across generations? Was it something that combined both functions in ways that our modern categorical distinctions between the political and the sacred cannot easily accommodate? The stones do not answer these questions directly. They simply stand, as they have always stood, in their patient rings across the laterite plain. Each circle a complete statement, each pillar a presence, each arrangement a claim on the landscape that has outlasted every other trace of the people who built it. There are circles here that have never been excavated, groupings that have been identified from aerial survey but not yet visited on foot by any research team, sections of the broader landscape where the full distribution of the tradition remains incompletely mapped. The Gambia River moves past in the middle distance, as it always has, carrying its red-brown water toward the sea. And somewhere in the unexamined ground beneath the standing stones, in the undisturbed earth that no spade has yet reached, the record of 2,000 years of returning, of building, of honoring the dead in laterite and intention, waits in the patient dark. Still holding, still keeping. Whatever it was given to keep, the stone circles of Senegambia have given us something to carry forward. The understanding that monumentality, the human impulse to arrange stone in ways that outlast individual lives, that organize landscape around the presence of the dead, that make permanent and visible what would otherwise dissolve into silence, is not the exclusive inheritance of the civilizations that Western archaeology has traditionally centered. It belongs to the whole human world, to the West African laterite plains as much as to the English chalk downlands, to the Ethiopian highlands as much as to the Egyptian desert, to communities whose names we do not know, whose languages have left no written trace, whose beliefs survive only in the geometry of what they built and the orientation of what they placed in the ground. That understanding travels with us now as we move northward and eastward, back across the African continent, back across the Mediterranean world, back into the ancient landscape of the Levant, to a corner of that landscape that sits at one of the most contested and historically layered intersections on Earth, and that contains, quietly embedded within its modern complexity, some of the oldest and least examined megalithic monuments in the entire Middle East. We are going to Jordan, specifically to the basalt and limestone terrain of northern Jordan, in the region near the modern town of Irbid, where the landscape rises and falls in a series of ancient hills and valleys that have been settled, farmed, fought over, and built upon continuously for more than 10,000 years. And here, partially obscured by modern agricultural activity, by centuries of stone robbing for later construction, and by the simple accumulation of soil and vegetation that time deposits over everything it does not actively destroy, there are dolmens. The word comes from the Breton language of northwestern France, where similar structures were first systematically described by European antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries. A dolmen, in its simplest definition, is a megalithic tomb, a burial chamber constructed from large upright stones, topped by one or more horizontal capstones, forming a table-like or box-like structure that was typically covered, in its original form, by a mound of earth or smaller stones. The mound, in most cases, is gone. What survives is the stone skeleton beneath, the uprights and capstones standing exposed in the landscape, stripped of their earthen covering by millennia of erosion and human disturbance, looking exactly like what they are described as being in the word dolmen itself, which translates approximately as stone table. The Dolmens of Al-souta, named for the region of northern Jordan, where one of the more significant concentrations has been identified and partially studied, are part of a much broader megalithic tradition that extends across the entire Levantine landscape. From southern Syria through Jordan, across the Palestinian highlands and lowlands, and into the Sinai, thousands of dolmens have been documented. One of the largest concentrations of megalithic funerary monuments anywhere outside of Europe, and one of the least discussed in popular literature on ancient monuments. That relative obscurity is partly a function of circumstance. The Levant is a landscape so saturated with archaeological significance across so many periods: Bronze Age cities, Iron Age kingdoms, Hellenistic temples, Roman roads, Byzantine churches, Islamic monuments, that its prehistoric layers are perpetually competing for attention and resources with more historically legible remains. Dolmens that might command significant research investment if they stood in a less archaeologically crowded landscape are here simply one layer among many, their silent stone forms pressed beneath the accumulated weight of everything that came after. The Al-souta dolmens are constructed from the local basalt and limestone, massive, dark, dense stones that required considerable effort to quarry, shape to the degree they were shaped, and arrange in their current configurations. The capstones of the larger examples weigh tens of tons. The uprights that support them are set with a stability that has maintained the basic structural integrity of many of these chambers across several thousand years of exposure to seismic activity, agricultural disturbance, and the chronic opportunism of later builders looking for ready-cut stone. Dating the Levantine dolmens broadly places them in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods, roughly 4500 to 2000 BC, though the full chronological range of the tradition, and the question of whether particular examples at the earlier or later ends of that range represent distinct cultural phases or continuous development, remains an active area of research. Human remains and grave goods recovered from excavated examples confirm the funerary function. The dead interred within these chambers were, in some cases, multiple individuals. Sequential burials that suggest the dolmens were used over extended periods, reopened and reused by communities that maintained a relationship with these specific monuments across generations. The mainstream interpretation is funerary and territorial, dolmens as ancestral markers, as claims on land legitimized by the presence of the dead, as nodes in a landscape of memory that organize the movement and self-understanding of living communities around the permanent addresses of their forebears. That interpretation is coherent and well supported, but the spatial dimension of the Al-souta dolmens, their positioning within the landscape, their relationship to one another and to the topography around them, raises questions that the straightforwardly funerary reading does not fully absorb. The placement of individual dolmens on ridgelines, hilltops, and elevated positions with wide visual horizons is a consistent feature of the tradition across the Levant, and Al-souta is no exception. These were not hidden monuments. They were visible ones, positioned to be seen from a distance, to punctuate and organize the landscape as perceived by people moving through it. Whether that visibility served primarily practical purposes, territorial demarcation, route marking, the communication of land claims to neighboring communities, or carried additional cosmological significance connected to the sky, the horizon, and the relationship between earthly and celestial geography, is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve. Some researchers have noted orientations among Levantine dolmens that suggest awareness of solar or lunar rising and setting points, deliberate alignments that would have connected the chambers of the dead to the movement of light across the sky in ways meaningful to communities whose entire understanding of time, season, and sacred geography was organized around celestial observation. The evidence for systematic astronomical alignment in the Levantine dolmen tradition is preliminary and contested, but the stones themselves, massive, dark, patient in the northern Jordanian hills, are oriented as they are oriented, facing what they face, aligned with what they are aligned with. Whether that alignment was intentional, whether it encoded meaning that mattered to the people who set these stones in place 5,000 years ago, is a question whose answer may be permanently beyond recovery, or may simply be waiting for the right question to be asked of the right stone, in the right light, at the right time of year. The capstones catch the afternoon sun with a particular quality, that heavy basalt darkness warming almost imperceptibly at the edges, as if the stone remembers, in some cellular way, the hands that moved it. As if it is still, in some sense, oriented toward something, still waiting to be read. The Dolmens of Al-souta have left us standing at the edge of something. At the edge of what stone can hold and what it cannot. At the edge of what orientation and alignment can tell us about the minds that arrange them, and where that telling runs out, where the evidence thins and the questions multiply, and the honest answer is simply that we do not know. Not yet, perhaps not ever. That edge, that threshold between the recoverable and the permanently lost, is one we will encounter again and again as this journey continues. It is not a failure of archaeology. It is a feature of the past itself. Most of what human beings have done, believed, built, and set across the full span of our existence on this planet has left no recoverable trace. What survives is not a representative sample. It is a residue, a fraction of a fraction, preserved by accident of material, climate, geography, and fortune, from which we attempt, carefully, imperfectly, necessarily, to reconstruct something of the whole. Sometimes that residue is stone, sometimes it is ceramic, sometimes it is bone, and sometimes, if circumstances are right, if the soil chemistry cooperates, if the burial practices of a particular culture align with the conditions that favor preservation, if the site remains undisturbed long enough for modern archaeology to reach it before looting does, what survives is something far more immediate and far more humanly affecting than stone or pottery. What survives are the figures. We travel westward again now, back across the African continent, but this time further south than Senegambia, down into the Sahel, the narrow band of semi-arid transition zone that runs across Africa between the Sahara to the north and the more fertile savanna lands to the south. We are going to Niger, specifically to the southwestern region of the country, in the area near the modern town of Bura, close to the banks of the Serba River, where it winds through a landscape of sandy soil, sparse woodland, and ancient occupation layers that have barely begun to be systematically investigated. The site, or more precisely, the complex of related sites, is known as the Bura-Asina Necropolis, and it is, by the quiet consensus of the specialists who have worked there, one of the most extraordinary and most underappreciated archaeological discoveries in all of sub-Saharan Africa. The name necropolis means simply City of the Dead, and that name, for once, feels genuinely appropriate rather than merely evocative. The Bura-Asina complex is not a single burial site. It is an extended funerary landscape, a network of burial locations distributed across a wide area of the southwestern Niger terrain, connected by the shared cultural tradition that produced them and by the remarkable consistency of the material culture they contain. Dozens of burial sites have been identified across the region. The full extent of the complex, how many individual burial locations exist, how far the tradition extends geographically, how many individuals were interred across the full span of its use, remains unknown, and current estimates are almost certainly conservative. What the Bura-Asina burials contain is what makes the site genuinely remarkable. The dead here were not buried alone. They were buried with ceramic objects, vessels, yes, as is common across ancient funerary traditions worldwide, but also something rarer and more arresting: ceramic figures, terracotta sculptures of human forms, placed in deliberate association with the deceased, in quantities and with a quality of craftsmanship that immediately signals the existence of a sophisticated artistic tradition operating in this landscape, at a time when, by conventional historical narratives, this region of Africa was not supposed to have been producing art of this character. The figures are extraordinary, standing or seated human forms, modeled in terracotta with a level of anatomical observation and artistic intention that places them in a completely different category from utilitarian ceramic production. They have faces, individual, expressive faces with features rendered with enough specificity to suggest that at least some of them were intended as portraits, or as representations of particular individuals rather than generic human types. They have hairstyles, scarification patterns, jewelry, and clothing details that encode information about the social identity, status, and cultural affiliation of either the figures themselves or the individuals they accompanied in death. Some wear elaborate headdresses. Others carry objects, tools, weapons, vessels, whose specific significance in the burial context is not yet fully understood. The terracotta figures of Bura-Asina have been dated to a broad range spanning roughly 200 BC to 1200 AD, a window of approximately 14 centuries, during which the tradition was maintained and practiced across the region with a consistency that implies strong cultural continuity. That dating places the tradition in the Iron Age of West African prehistory, a period of increasing social complexity, expanding trade networks, and intensifying agricultural and craft production across the Sahel and savanna zones. The people of Bura-Asina were not isolated. They were participants in a wider world of exchange and interaction whose full dimensions are still being mapped. The mainstream archaeological interpretation frames the Bura-Asina figures within the context of West African ancestral veneration traditions, the same broad framework we invoked for the Senegambian circles, and, in different form, for the stele of Tiya. The figures, in this reading, served as proxies, companions, or embodied presences for the dead, objects that maintained the identity and social personhood of the deceased in a form that could be housed, honored, and engaged with by the living community that continued to exist after them. They were not decorative. They were functional. They performed a social and spiritual role in the ongoing relationship between living and dead that was, for the communities that produced them, as necessary and as serious as any other aspect of community life. That framework is culturally grounded and archaeologically coherent, but it leaves considerable space for questions that the evidence, in its current state, cannot answer. The artistic sophistication of the Bura-Asina figures, the individuality of the faces, the specificity of the cultural details they encode, the consistency of the tradition across 14 centuries and multiple burial sites, implies an institutional context for their production that goes beyond simple household craft. These were not objects made casually by whoever happened to be available in the immediate aftermath of a death. They reflect training, a sustained craft tradition with standards, with knowledge transmitted deliberately from practitioner to practitioner, with an investment of skilled labor that presupposes a community sufficiently organized and sufficiently prosperous to support specialist production. Who were those specialists? How were they trained? What was the institutional framework, the workshop, the guild, the ritual specialists, or something else entirely, within which this tradition was maintained and transmitted across 14 centuries? No answer has yet been assembled from the available evidence. There is a further complication that adds another layer of difficulty to the Bura-Asina picture. The site has been severely affected by looting. The international art market's appetite for African antiquities, particularly terracotta figures of the kind Bura-Asina produces, has driven systematic illegal excavation at sites across the region since at least the mid-20th century. Enormous quantities of Bura-Asina material have been removed from their archaeological context and dispersed into private collections and museum holdings worldwide, stripped of the contextual information. Precise location, stratigraphic position, associated materials that gives objects their full interpretive meaning. What has been lost, in terms of the questions that can no longer be asked because the evidence that would have answered them has been removed and decontextualized, is incalculable. Literally incalculable. We do not know what we do not know. We cannot reconstruct the picture from fragments that have been scattered across the globe into context designed for aesthetic appreciation rather than archaeological understanding. The legitimate excavations that have been conducted at Bura-Asina sites, careful, methodical, contextually sensitive work by Nigerian and international researchers operating under extremely difficult conditions of funding and infrastructure, have produced results that consistently suggest the tradition is larger, more complex, and more chronologically deep than current understanding reflects. Somewhere in the sandy soil of southwestern Niger, in the undisturbed burial contexts that looting has not yet reached, and that legitimate archaeology has not yet had the resources to investigate, the full picture waits. Figures with faces that were once known by name. Placed in the ground with intention, with grief, with whatever understanding of death and continuity and the relationship between the living and the lost that the people of Bura-Asina carried with them through 14 centuries of practicing, maintaining and passing on the tradition of accompanying their dead with art. They made faces for the gone. And the faces are still there, patient in the dark, keeping the company they were made to keep. The faces of Bura-Asina stay with us as we travel. That is the particular power of figurative art, its capacity to cross the distances that separate us from the past and arrive still recognizably human in the present. A ceramic face made 14 centuries ago by hands whose owner's name we will never know can still stop us. Can still produce the quiet shock of recognition that comes from encountering another person across an impossible interval of time. The dead of Bura-Asina had faces that mattered to someone, had identities specific enough to be worth preserving in fired clay, had lives that a living community found worth marking, honoring, accompanying into the earth with objects of care and craft and intention. We carry that recognition with us now as we travel northward and eastward. Back across the Sahel, back across the desert, back into the landscape of the ancient Middle East that has already given us so much on this journey. The Mustatils, the desert kites, the rock-cut tombs of Al-Hayt, the coastal plains of As-sabiyah. That landscape, it seems, is not yet finished with us. There is more it wants to show. We are going to Jordan again, but not to the basalt hills of the north, where the Dolmens of Al-souta sit in their patient orientations. We travel further east this time, out toward the arid margins of the country, where the fertile western highlands give way to the drier, harder terrain of the eastern plateau, and where the land begins its long, gradual transition toward the desert expanses of the Arabian interior. In this eastern Jordanian landscape, roughly in the region between the modern towns of Zarqa and Azraq, a mountain rises from the surrounding plateau with enough prominence to have served as a landmark for every traveler, trader, and migrating community that has moved through this corridor for the past several thousand years. It is not a dramatic peak by Alpine or Andean standards, but in a landscape of relatively flat plateau, any significant elevation draws the eye, organizes the terrain, and accumulates over time the kind of human attention that tends to leave permanent marks. The mountain is called Jebel Al-Mutawwaq, and the marks it has accumulated are extraordinary, The site that bears this name, spreading across the slopes and summit area of the Jebel and its immediate surroundings, is one of the largest and most complex prehistoric settlement and funerary landscapes in all of Jordan. It encompasses an enormous range of archaeological features distributed across a wide area. The remains of ancient settlement structures, cairn fields, burial tumuli of varying sizes and forms, enclosures, walls, and stone arrangements whose functions span the full spectrum from domestic habitation to ceremonial and funerary practice. The sheer density of human activity represented in the Jebel Al-Mutawwaq landscape, layer upon layer, period upon period, each one pressing its evidence into the same terrain that all the others also claimed, makes it one of those sites where the archaeological picture is simultaneously rich beyond expectation and difficult beyond comfort to disentangle. The funerary component is the most visually striking. Across the slopes of the Jebel and the surrounding plateau, burial tumuli, stone-built mounds covering the remains of the dead, are distributed in concentrations that, in the densest areas, approach something close to a necropolis. They vary considerably in size and construction. Some are modest cairns, simple accumulations of fieldstone marking individual or small group burials with minimal architectural elaboration. Others are more substantial, carefully constructed mounds with defined curbstones, internal chamber arrangements, and evidence of the kind of deliberate spatial planning that implies significant community investment in the funerary landscape. The chronological range of the Jebel Al-Mutawwaq complex is, like so many of the sites we have visited on this journey, both impressive and frustrating in its breadth. Evidence of human activity at the site spans from the Chalcolithic period, roughly 4500 to 3600 BC, through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age and later historic periods. That span of nearly 6,000 years of continuous or intermittent human engagement with this particular mountain represents one of the longest documented sequences of site use in the Eastern Jordanian archaeological record. Why this mountain? Why did communities return to Jebel Al-Mutawwaq across such an extraordinary span of time, choosing it repeatedly as a place to settle, to bury their dead, to invest their labor in permanent stone constructions that they knew would outlast them? The practical answers are available and reasonable. The Jebel offers elevated ground with wide visual horizons, strategically advantageous for communities monitoring movement across the surrounding plateau. The area around the mountain includes water sources and seasonal grazing that would have supported the pastoral and semi-pastoral communities whose evidence dominates the archaeological record. The mountain's prominence in the landscape would have made it a natural waypoint on the ancient routes connecting the settled lands of western Jordan with the desert interior and the trading corridors that ran through it. All of that is true, and none of it fully accounts for the intensity and duration of human engagement that Jebel Al-Mutawwaq represents. The mainstream archaeological interpretation emphasizes the site's function as a central place, a location that served as a focal point for the wider surrounding community, concentrating activities of social, economic, and ritual significance that were distributed across the broader landscape during ordinary times but periodically drawn together at this particular spot. The funerary landscape, in this reading, is both a record of the dead and a living infrastructure for the social reproduction of the communities that created and maintained it. A place where the accumulation of ancestral burials across generations created a density of ancestral presence that made the mountain itself sacred, authoritative, worth returning to. That interpretation has significant support in the ethnographic and archaeological literature on similar sites across the ancient Middle East and broader Old World. Mountains, in many ancient cultural traditions, occupied a category that was simultaneously topographic and cosmological, places where the vertical axis of the world was concentrated, where the distance between human and divine was understood to be thinner than elsewhere, where the accumulated presence of the dead created a geography of power that the living could access and invoke. But Jebel Al-Mutawwaq presents some features that sit at the edges of that comfortable interpretive framework. Among the burial and settlement remains on the mountain, researchers have documented structural forms whose function resists easy classification. Certain enclosures and stone arrangements do not correspond neatly to the residential or funerary categories that account for most of the site's visible features. Their spatial positioning, their relationship to the broader layout of the funerary landscape, to the topography of the mountain, to possible sightlines and orientations, has led some investigators to suggest that they may have served ceremonial or ritual purposes distinct from both habitation and burial. Gathering places, perhaps. Spaces for the performance of practices, rites, ceremonies, negotiations that required a specific and significant location but left no material signature distinctive enough to identify their nature with confidence. What those practices were, who conducted them, and what they were understood to accomplish in the cosmological framework of the communities that gathered here, these questions remain open. The site has been the subject of important survey and excavation work by Jordanian and international research teams, particularly in the later decades of the 20th century and into the 21st. That work has substantially expanded understanding of the site's chronological depth, its spatial complexity, and the range of activities it hosted across its long history. It has also, as good archaeology always does, generated as many new questions as it has resolved old ones. Large portions of the Jebel Al-Mutawwaq landscape remain incompletely surveyed. The full extent of the funerary field, how many tumuli exist across the total area of the site, what their complete distribution reveals about the spatial logic of the funerary landscape as a whole, has not been definitively established. Subsurface features whose presence has been suggested by surface indications but not yet confirmed by excavation may substantially alter the picture of what this site was and how it functioned. The mountain stands as it has always stood. The plateau stretches away from it in every direction, flat and ancient and largely empty. And somewhere on those slopes, beneath the surface of a landscape that has been accumulating human meaning for 6,000 years, the next layer of the story waits. Patient, as the dead always are. For someone to come and ask the right question in the right place, at the right depth, Jebel Al-Mutawwaq has shown us what a mountain can accumulate when human communities return to it across 6,000 years of need and meaning. Layer upon layer of the dead. Structure upon structure of stone arranged with intention. A landscape so saturated with human engagement across so many periods that the individual moments of its making, the specific days when specific people carried specific stones to specific places for specific reasons, have dissolved into a single, vast, undifferentiated presence. We know something happened here. We know it mattered. The precise texture of what it meant to be alive and present in this landscape, on any particular morning 6,000 years ago, is beyond our reach. But sometimes, rarely, and with a vividness that stops you cold, the past offers something more immediate than a tumulus or a stone alignment. Something that carries not just evidence of human presence but the actual mark of a human hand. The direct, unmediated trace of a person who stood in a specific place, pressed or struck or scraped a tool against a rock surface, and left behind an image that has survived intact to the present day. We are going back into Saudi Arabia now, into the northern part of the country, into the Hyle region that we visited earlier in our journey when we explored the rock-cut tombs of Al-Hayt. But we travel further north this time, toward a basin in the Nafud Desert, where the landscape opens into a wide, flat depression surrounded by sandstone outcrops and jebels. Rocky hills whose surfaces, it turns out, have been serving as canvases for the people who lived in and passed through this basin for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The town of Jubbah sits in this basin, and around it, on the sandstone rock faces of the surrounding hills, particularly on the prominent outcrop known as Jebel Al-Mutawwaq, is one of the most extensive and most chronologically layered collections of rock art anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula. The Petroglyphs of Jubbah are not paintings like the figures of Wadi Sura. They are carvings, images incised, pecked, or abraded directly into the sandstone surface, created by removing the darker, weathered outer layer of the rock to expose the lighter stone beneath. The technique varies across different periods and different hands, and those variations in technique, combined with the degree of repatination, the weathering of the exposed surfaces back toward the color of the surrounding rock, provide one of the primary tools researchers use to establish relative chronology across what is, in terms of the sheer number of individual images, an overwhelming visual archive. How many images are there? Estimates run into the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, when the full extent of the decorated surfaces in the wider Jubbah Basin is taken into account. They are distributed across multiple rock faces and panels, sometimes overlapping. Later images carved over earlier ones, the newer figures partially obscuring the older in a visual stratigraphy that mirrors, in a direct and literal way, the stratigraphic sequences that archaeologists read in excavated soil. The chronological range is extraordinary. The oldest images at Jubbah, identified on the basis of their degree of repatination, their stylistic characteristics, and their relationship to the paleo-environmental context established by independent geological evidence, are estimated to date back as far as 10,000 years or more. That places the earliest Jubbah petroglyphs in the Neolithic, contemporaneous with the Mustatils, the wheel structures of Harrat Khaybar, and the painted figures of Wadi Sura, all products of that same remarkable window of the African humid period, when the Arabian Peninsula was wetter, greener, and far more densely inhabited than the desert landscape of today suggests, and the images reflect that vanished world with striking directness. Among the oldest and most celebrated of the Jubbah petroglyphs are depictions of animals that have not lived in this part of Arabia for thousands of years. Elephants, giraffes, their long necks and distinctive spotted forms rendered with an observational accuracy that could only have been achieved by people who had seen these animals in person, in this landscape, as a normal feature of their lived environment. Aurochs, the massive, wild cattle that were the ancestors of domestic breeds. Hippopotamus, in at least some interpretations of more ambiguous forms. A bestiary of a world that no longer exists, preserved in the rock faces of a desert basin by the hands of people who lived in a green Arabia and who documented what they saw around them with a directness and a skill that continues to command respect. There are human figures too, many of them. Hunters with bows, depicted in postures of pursuit and action that convey movement and intention across millennia of static stone. Dancers or figures in ritual postures, arms raised, bodies arranged in ways that suggest ceremony rather than ordinary activity. Figures of ambiguous character, neither clearly human nor clearly animal, occupying that liminal space between categories that appears in the rock art of so many ancient cultures worldwide, and that most researchers interpret as evidence of shamanistic or cosmological belief systems in which the boundary between human and animal was permeable and ritually significant. And then there are the inscriptions. Because Jubbah is not only a site of prehistoric image-making, the rock faces that attracted the earliest Neolithic carvers continued to attract attention across the subsequent millennia, and among the later additions to the Jubbah petroglyph corpus are texts, inscriptions in ancient Arabian scripts, most significantly in Dadanitic and Taymanitic, that date to the 1st millennium BC, and that place the site within the literate, historically traceable world of ancient North Arabian culture. These inscriptions are themselves significant. They represent some of the earliest evidence of writing in the Arabian Peninsula, a bridge between the prehistoric image-making tradition and the historical record that eventually becomes readable in the conventional sense. But the inscriptions also create an interpretive complication that researchers have not fully resolved. The people who added those 1st millennium BC inscriptions to the Jubbah rock faces were doing so in a landscape already thick with much older images. They could see the ancient carvings around them, the elephants, the giraffes, the Neolithic hunters. They chose to add their own marks to surfaces already covered with the traces of their predecessors. Was that choice meaningful? Were they aware, on some level, of the antiquity of what surrounded them? Did the accumulated presence of those older images contribute to the significance of the site, making it a place where the act of inscription carried particular weight precisely because so many others had inscribed here before? We cannot know, but the question is not entirely idle. Across many ancient cultures, sites of accumulated rock art were understood as charged places, locations where the rock itself was understood as a membrane between the ordinary world and something beyond it, and where the act of carving was understood as a form of communication directed through that membrane rather than simply at the surface. The accumulation of images over time in this framework was not decorative or incidental. It was additive, each new image drawing on and contributing to the power of everything that had been placed there before. Whether that was how the people of ancient Jubbah understood their own practice of image-making is a question no inscription has yet answered. What the rock faces have given us is the images themselves, thousands of them, ranging across 10 millennia of human presence in this basin, from the Neolithic hunter watching an elephant move across a green landscape, to the Iron Age scribe pressing an inscription into stone already ancient by the time his chisel touched it, to the researchers and visitors who stand before these surfaces today and attempt, with varying degrees of success, to read what was written there. The sandstone holds every layer simultaneously. The elephant and the inscription occupy the same surface. The hunter and the dancer and the ambiguous figure between categories, all of them present, all of them patient, all of them available to whoever stands before the rock and takes the time to look. What did they see, the people who stood in this same place 10,000 years ago and raised their tools to this same stone? What were they trying to say, and to whom? The petroglyphs of Jubbah have given us something rare and precious: direct contact. The unmediated trace of human hands pressing intention into stone across 10,000 years of continuous return to the same surfaces, the same rock faces, the same desert basin where an ancient green world slowly dried into the landscape we know today. There is something about rock art, about the directness of the mark, the immediacy of the image, the absence of any intermediary between the hand that made it and the eye that reads it across millennia, that brings the past closer than almost any other category of archaeological evidence. But there is another category of ancient object that produces a similar effect. That stops you not with the intimacy of a carved line but with something larger, something that operates at the scale of the body rather than the scale of the hand. Something that confronts you, physically and spatially, and demands that you reckon with the mind that conceived it and the hands that somehow brought it into being. We cross an ocean again now, from the sandstone basins of northern Saudi Arabia to the tropical lowlands of Central America, to the Pacific coastal plain of southern Costa Rica, where the Diquis River winds through a landscape of dense rainforest, wetland, and agricultural land that was, in the pre-Columbian world, one of the most richly inhabited and culturally sophisticated regions of lower Central America. Here, in this landscape, someone made spheres. perfect spheres, or as close to perfect as stone can be made by human hands, working without metal tools, without precision instruments, without any technology that the archaeological record of the region documents. Spheres of granodiorite and other hard igneous stone, ranging in size from a few centimeters in diameter to over 2 meters, the largest examples weighing in excess of 15 tons, carved and ground and polished into forms so geometrically regular that modern measurement, using precision instruments, finds deviations from true spherical form of less than 2% in the most accomplished examples. Less than 2%, in 15 tons of granodiorite, shaped by hand. The Diquis Delta stone spheres, known locally as Las Bolas, simply the balls, were first brought to widespread outside attention in the 1930s, when the United Fruit Company began clearing land in the Diquis Delta region for banana plantation agriculture. Workers clearing jungle encountered the spheres partially buried in the forest floor, and the company's operations, which prioritized agricultural productivity over archaeological sensitivity, resulted in many of the spheres being moved, relocated, or in some cases dynamited by workers who believed, based on rumors that circulated through the labor force, that the spheres might contain gold inside them. They did not contain gold, they contained nothing. They were solid stone, through and through, shaped from the outside with a patience and a skill, whose nature and method we still cannot fully account for. The damage done by those early decades of agricultural expansion was severe, and, in archaeological terms, irreversible. Spheres were removed from their original positions and relocated to serve as decorative elements in gardens, on roadsides, in public spaces. The spatial relationships between individual spheres, relationships that, if original, might have encoded information about their arrangement, their orientation, their function within the broader landscape, were destroyed before anyone with the knowledge to record them had the opportunity to do so. What archaeological investigation has been able to establish, from the spheres that remained in or near their original contexts, is partial but significant. The spheres are associated with the Cherokee cultural period, broadly dated to between roughly 600 and 1500 AD, the several centuries before European contact during which the complex chiefdom societies of the Diquis Delta reached their greatest elaboration. They are found in association with the remains of ancient settlements, burial sites, and what appear to have been elite residential or ceremonial compounds. Several sites have yielded spheres arranged in specific configurations, lines, triangles, and other geometric groupings that suggest deliberate spatial organization rather than random placement. The mainstream archaeological interpretation frames the spheres as prestige objects, manifestations of chiefly power, symbols of status and authority produced by specialist craftspeople working under elite patronage and displayed in the public or ceremonial spaces of high-status settlements as visible demonstrations of the resources, organizational capacity, and cosmological legitimacy of the ruling class. In many ancient societies, the ability to commission extraordinary objects that required exceptional skill, exceptional time, and exceptional material investment to produce, was itself a form of political communication. The sphere in this reading said something specific about the power of whoever could cause it to be made. That interpretation is coherent and well-grounded in the comparative literature on prestige goods and chiefly display in ancient societies. It accounts for the association of the spheres with high-status contexts, for their distribution across the Diquis Delta landscape, in patterns that correlate with known centers of political authority, and for the variation in their size. The largest and most technically accomplished spheres concentrated at the most significant sites, the smaller and less perfect examples more widely distributed. But it leaves the central technical question entirely unaddressed. How were they made? experimental archaeology has made attempts to replicate the Diquis spheres using only the tools and materials that would have been available to their makers: stone hammers, abrasive materials, the patient application of physical labor across extended time periods. Those experiments have been instructive and, in some ways, encouraging. They have demonstrated that spherical forms of some accuracy can be achieved through sustained grinding and abrasion without metal tools or precision instruments. But they have not yet produced results that approach the geometric precision of the finest Diquis examples at anywhere near the scale of the largest spheres. The gap between what experimental replication has achieved and what the ancient craftspeople of the Diquis Delta actually produced remains unresolved. And that gap, modest in percentage terms, enormous in practical terms when applied to 15 tons of hard igneous stone, is where the most interesting and most contested questions about the spheres reside. Some researchers have proposed that the ancient craftspeople possessed sophisticated knowledge of geometric principles, perhaps transmitted through oral tradition, perhaps encoded in physical templates or measuring tools that have not survived, that allowed them to achieve and verify spherical accuracy at scales that exceed what trial-and-error grinding alone would reliably produce. Others have suggested the possible use of rotating frames or other simple mechanical aids that, while not preserved in the archaeological record, would not be inconsistent with the technological capabilities of chiefdom-level societies. A smaller number of investigators, working at the more speculative edge of the field, have proposed connections between the Diquis sphere tradition and broader patterns of circular and spherical symbolism across the ancient Americas, suggesting that the spheres may encode cosmological meanings related to celestial bodies, to the structure of the universe as the Cherokee people understood it, or to specific astronomical phenomena that held ritual significance in their calendrical and religious traditions. None of these proposals has achieved the status of demonstrated explanation. The spheres remain, technically and interpretively, incompletely understood. There is an image that captures something essential about the Diquis Delta sculptures. A large sphere sitting in a jungle clearing, its surface darkened by age and exposure, its form precise and somehow alien against the organic chaos of the surrounding forest. The sphere does not belong to the landscape in the way that a tumulus or a cairn or a carved cliff face belongs to its landscape. It sits within the forest but apart from it, geometrically complete, self-contained, indifferent, in its perfect roundness, to everything that the world of growth and decay and organic process represents. Whoever made these objects understood something about the circle, about the perfection of a form that has no beginning and no end, no preferred orientation, no hierarchy of surfaces. Why that form? Why here? Why at this scale, in this material, with this degree of uncompromising geometric commitment? The spheres offer no answer. They simply sit, as they have always sat, in their particular quality of patient, spherical silence, waiting, perhaps, for a question precise enough to deserve one. The spheres of the Diquis Delta have left us with a particular kind of silence, the silence of a form that is complete in itself, that offers no obvious entry point, no seam, no edge to catch a question on. A geometry so resolved, so fundamentally finished, that it seems to resist interpretation not through obscurity but through a kind of absolute clarity, as if the sphere is simply what it is, and whatever meaning it carried has been sealed inside it as permanently and as inaccessibly as the stone heart that experimental archaeologists once hoped might be gold. We carry that silence with us now as we travel. And we travel far, further east than we have gone on this journey, across the Pacific, across the Indian subcontinent, into a part of the world that holds megalithic traditions as ancient and as complex as anything we have encountered, and yet which remains, in the popular imagination of ancient mysteries, almost entirely unknown. We are going to India, not to the famous monuments of the north, not to the temples of Rajasthan or the gates of Varanasi or the forts of the Mughal heartland. We travel instead to the Deccan Plateau of south-central India, to the state of Telangana, where the landscape opens into a wide, rocky terrain of granite outcrops, scrub forest, and ancient red soil that has been farmed and grazed and inhabited by human communities for longer than the available historical record can fully trace. And here, in this landscape, there are megaliths. The site, or more precisely, the cluster of related sites associated with the name Nilurallu, sits in this Deccan terrain, part of a vast and still incompletely documented megalithic tradition that spreads across the entire southern peninsula of India and that represents, in aggregate, one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric monument building anywhere in Asia. The South Indian megalithic tradition has been known to archaeology since the 19th century. It has been studied, surveyed, and partially excavated across more than a century of academic investigation, and it remains, despite that attention, one of the most poorly understood major archaeological phenomena in the world. The megaliths of Nilurallu are representative of the broader South Indian tradition while also presenting features specific enough to merit individual attention. The monuments here include several of the characteristic forms that define the South Indian megalithic vocabulary: dolmenoid cists, which are box-like stone chambers constructed from large upright slabs and capstones, closely related in basic form to the dolmens we encountered in Jordan; cairn circles, in which a central burial feature is surrounded by a ring of upright stones; and menhirs, single standing stones, planted upright in the earth, ranging from modest to impressively large in scale, whose function in the South Indian context is debated, but almost certainly connected to commemoration, territorial marking, or the anchoring of ancestral presence in the landscape. What makes Nilurallu particularly significant within the broader South Indian megalithic picture is the density and variety of monument types represented within a relatively concentrated area, and the degree to which the spatial relationships between different monument types appear to reflect deliberate landscape planning rather than simple accumulation. The monuments are not scattered randomly across the terrain. They cluster, they orient, they relate to one another and to the surrounding topography in ways that suggest the people who built them conceived of the landscape as a whole, as a field of meaning within which individual monuments occupied specific positions for specific reasons. The chronology of the South Indian megalithic tradition is one of its most discussed and most contested features. Radiocarbon, dating from excavated examples across the tradition, places most activity within a broad range of roughly 1200 to 300 BC, the Iron Age of South Indian prehistory, a period of significant social and technological change across the subcontinent that saw the widespread adoption of iron tools, the intensification of agriculture, the growth of settled communities, and the increasing complexity of social organization that eventually gave rise to the early historic states of southern India. The association with iron is significant and, to some researchers, puzzling in its own right. The South Indian megalithic tradition is almost universally associated with iron. Iron objects appear consistently in the burial assemblages recovered from megalithic contexts, and the emergence of the tradition appears to coincide broadly with the introduction of iron technology to the region. Whether iron enabled megalith building, providing more effective tools for quarrying and shaping stone, or whether the two phenomena were connected by a shared cultural transformation whose nature we don't yet fully understand, is a question that the archaeological evidence has not resolved. The burial function of the Nilurallu megaliths, as with the broader South Indian tradition, is well established. Excavated chambers have yielded human skeletal remains, ceramics, iron and copper objects, beads of semi-precious stone and glass, and occasionally gold ornaments, assemblages that reflect communities engaged in long-distance trade networks, in craft specialization, and in a funerary practice that invested significant material resources in equipping the dead for whatever was understood to follow life. The mainstream interpretation frames this funerary investment within the context of ancestral veneration traditions broadly similar to those we have encountered at Tiya, at the Senegambian circles, and at the Dolmens of Jordan, communities for whom the dead remained active social presences, whose proper acknowledgement was essential to the well-being and legitimacy of the living. The megalithic chamber, in this reading, was not merely a grave, but an address, a permanent, stone-built location where the ancestral dead could be found, consulted, and maintained in relationship with the community that continued after them. But Nilurallu and its surrounding landscape present features that exceed the straightforwardly funerary. Among the menhirs, the single standing stones distributed across the landscape around the burial monuments. There are examples whose size and careful positioning suggest functions beyond simple grave marking. Some of these stones are aligned in ways that appear deliberately oriented toward specific horizon features or astronomical reference points. The precision of these potential alignments varies across examples and has not been systematically verified for the Nilurallu sites specifically, but similar claims have been made and partially supported for megalithic sites elsewhere in the South Indian tradition, raising the possibility that astronomical awareness was integrated into the landscape planning of these monuments in ways that current research has not yet fully characterized. There is also a feature of the South Indian megalithic tradition that has attracted particular attention from a small number of researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and oral tradition studies. Across many communities in southern India, living memory, transmitted through oral tradition, through local legend, through the knowledge held by particular families or caste groups with hereditary connections to specific landscape features, preserves accounts of the megaliths that do not correspond neatly to the Iron Age dating established by archaeological excavation. Some oral traditions describe the monuments as the work of a race of beings, giants, heroes, or supernatural entities, whose nature and period of activity is placed in a more remote past than the archaeological timeline allows. Others describe ritual practices associated with specific monument sites that, if historically grounded, would imply a continuity of use from the prehistoric period into the early historical era that formal archaeology has not yet documented. These oral traditions are not archaeological evidence in the formal sense, but they are data, imperfect, transformed by centuries of transmission, but potentially carrying traces of genuine historical memory that purely material investigation cannot access. How far back does the human relationship with this particular landscape actually go? The Iron Age monuments are visible and datable. What lies beneath them, what earlier occupation, what prior engagement with these specific outcrops and these specific orientations has in most places not been investigated at the depth required to answer that question. The granite outcrops of the Deccan Plateau are old, genuinely old, among the most ancient exposed rock surfaces on Earth, shaped by geological processes that predate human existence by billions of years. The people who chose these specific outcrops in this specific landscape for their monuments were choosing surfaces that already had a quality of ancient permanence about them. Did they know that? Did the age of the rock itself contribute to its significance? The stone does not say. It simply persists in the dry heat of the Deccan afternoon, holding its monuments and its questions with the same impartial, geological patience it has always had. And somewhere beneath the surveyed and partially excavated surface of the Nilurallu landscape, in the undisturbed deposits that no excavation has yet reached, the fuller story of who built here and why, and what they understood themselves to be doing, waits in the ancient red soil. patient as granite, deep as time. The megaliths of Nilurallu have held us in the landscape of southern India, in the granite outcrops and red soil of the Deccan, among monuments built by people whose names we don't know, whose beliefs we can only partially reconstruct, whose relationship to the ancient rock they chose as the material of their permanence remains only partly legible. We remain in the Indian subcontinent now, but we travel northward, up through the heart of the country, past the Great Plains of the Gangetic Basin, up into the foothills of the Himalayas, into a landscape that could not be more different from the dry, open plateau of Telangana. We are going to Kashmir, to the high, green, lake-filled valley that sits cradled between mountain ranges in the far north of the subcontinent. A landscape of extraordinary natural beauty that has been continuously inhabited for longer than its lush appearance might suggest. And here, in this valley, in a place called Burzahom, a name that translates approximately as place of birch trees in the local Kashmiri language, something was found that does not fit comfortably into any simple narrative about the capabilities and practices of prehistoric people. The site of Burzahom was excavated over several seasons beginning in the 1930s and continuing through subsequent decades, yielding evidence of a Neolithic settlement of considerable antiquity and complexity. The people who lived here, dating broadly to between roughly 3000 and 1500 BC, occupied a landscape of pit dwellings, practiced a mixed economy of hunting, herding, and early agriculture, produced a distinctive ceramic tradition, and buried their dead in ways that reflect a rich and carefully maintained funerary culture. By the standards of Neolithic South Asia, Burzahom is a significant and well-documented site, contributing important evidence to the broader understanding of prehistoric Kashmir and its connections to the wider world of ancient Central and South Asian prehistory. But among the human skeletal remains recovered from the Burzahom burials, something was noticed that elevated the site from regional significance to a place in a much wider and more unsettling conversation about the capabilities of ancient medicine. Several of the skulls, not one, not two, but multiple individuals across the skeletal assemblage, bear the marks of trepanation. Trepanation, the deliberate cutting, drilling, or scraping of a hole through the bone of the human skull, penetrating the cranium to expose the brain beneath. It is, by any measure, one of the most invasive surgical procedures imaginable. It is also, as the global archaeological record has established with increasing clarity over the past several decades, one of the oldest. Evidence of trepanation has been documented at prehistoric sites across Europe, across the Americas, across Africa and Asia, in assemblages ranging from the Mesolithic to the medieval period. A distribution so wide and so chronologically deep that it has forced a fundamental reassessment of what we are willing to credit to ancient medical knowledge and practice. The Burzahom examples are among the earliest documented instances of trepanation in South Asia, and they share a feature that makes them particularly significant within the global trepanation literature, a feature that elevates them from evidence of a single desperate intervention to evidence of something considerably more systematic and more astonishing. The individuals whose skulls bear trepanation marks at Burzahom survived the procedure. We know this because of bone. When bone is damaged, cut, fractured, penetrated, and the individual survives, the living tissue responds. It heals. New bone growth forms at the margins of the wound, gradually remodeling the edges of the defect in ways that are clearly distinguishable. To a trained eye examining the dry bone centuries or millennia later, from the sharp, unmodified edges of a wound that was inflicted at or near the time of death. The Burzahom skulls show this healing. The edges of the trepanation defects are rounded, remodeled, smoothed by the biological response of living tissue to penetrating injury. These people did not die on the operating surface, if we can call it that. They lived afterward. Some of them, based on the degree of healing visible in the bone, for years. Let that settle for a moment. Somewhere in Neolithic Kashmir, between 3,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, a person, or more than one person, across what appears to have been a community with some tradition of this practice, possessed the knowledge, the tools, and the skill to cut through human skull bone in a patient who survived, and to do so in conditions that did not result in immediate death from infection, hemorrhage, or surgical shock. The mainstream medical and archaeological interpretation acknowledges trepanation as genuine ancient surgery, a practice that, while it appears extraordinary from the perspective of modern assumptions about prehistoric capability, is in fact well documented globally, and does not require any revision of our fundamental understanding of ancient technology. Stone tools in skilled hands are entirely capable of the cutting and scraping required to perform trepanation. The procedure has been successfully replicated experimentally using only Neolithic appropriate implements, and the survival rates documented in the archaeological record, consistently higher than many modern observers initially expect, suggests that practitioners in many ancient cultures had developed, through accumulated trial and error across generations, a working empirical knowledge of which parts of the skull could be safely penetrated, how to manage bleeding, and how to care for patients in the post-operative period. That framework is reassuring in its rationality, and it is almost certainly correct in its basic parameters. But the Burzahom cases invite questions that the technical framework alone doesn't fully address. Why? What conditions or circumstances led Neolithic communities in Kashmir to develop and practice a procedure of this complexity and risk? The most widely offered explanations fall into two broad categories, medical and ritual, and the boundary between them in the ancient world was almost certainly far less distinct than modern thinking tends to assume. The medical explanations propose that trepanation was performed in response to specific clinical conditions: head injuries from violence or accident, chronic headaches or neurological symptoms whose underlying cause we cannot now determine, pressure on the brain from swelling or hemorrhage following trauma. In communities without any other means of addressing these conditions, the desperate logic of cutting a hole in the skull, releasing pressure, removing bone fragments, accessing whatever was understood to be causing suffering inside the head, is comprehensible, even if the knowledge that it could work required considerable empirical courage to acquire. The ritual explanations propose that trepanation served purposes connected to spiritual or cosmological belief, that the opening created in the skull was understood as a portal, a point of access between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it, and that the procedure was performed not only or primarily as a medical intervention but as a form of initiation, of spiritual modification, of deliberately altering the perceptual or spiritual status of the individual who underwent it. In many ancient cultures, these two categories, healing and ritual, were not meaningfully separate. The person who cut into skulls was simultaneously a medical practitioner and a spiritual specialist, operating within a framework in which physical and cosmological health were aspects of the same underlying reality. Which of these motivations drove the Burzahom trepanations, or in what proportion they combined, is a question the bone cannot answer directly. What the bone can tell us is simpler and, in its way, more affecting than any interpretive framework. Someone was in enough distress, physical, spiritual, or both, that the people responsible for their care decided that cutting through their skull was the right response. And someone else, a person with knowledge, with skill, with tools sharpened to a sufficient edge and hands steady enough to use them, agreed, and did it. And the patient lived. In a Neolithic settlement beside a birch-lined lake in the Kashmir Valley, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, someone survived brain surgery, performed by hands whose training we cannot reconstruct. using knowledge whose transmission we cannot trace, for reasons whose full nature we cannot recover from the evidence the bone has given us. What else did those hands know? And what else has the ground at Burzahom not yet given up? The skulls of Burzahom have reminded us of something we sometimes forget when we think about the ancient world: that the people who inhabited it were not simply builders of monuments, arrangers of stone, makers of ceramic figures and geometric earthworks. They were people in the fullest sense, people who suffered, who sought help for their suffering, who developed knowledge in response to need, and transmitted that knowledge across generations with a seriousness and a precision that the survival rates carved into their bones make impossible to dismiss. They felt pain. They feared death. They cared for one another across the threshold of procedures that required both the person holding the tool and the person receiving it to summon a quality of courage that most of us will never be called upon to match. We carry that humanizing recognition with us now as we travel. Northward and westward, out of the Kashmir Valley, out of the Indian subcontinent entirely, across the vast Eurasian landmass toward its northwestern edge, toward a part of the world that has its own long, complex, and in some respects still incompletely understood relationship with stone, with writing, with the dead, and with the meanings carved into objects that were sealed away from the living world in the darkness of burial chambers. We are going to Scandinavia, to the Swedish island of Gotland, sitting in the middle of the Baltic Sea between the Swedish mainland and the Estonian coast, a flat limestone island of remarkable archaeological richness whose long history of human occupation has left it layered with monuments, burial sites, and artifacts spanning from the Stone Age through the Viking period and beyond. Gotland is, in the world of Scandinavian archaeology, something close to a treasure island in the most literal sense, a place whose particular combination of geography, geology, and continuous habitation has preserved an extraordinary range of material from the deep past. And it is here, in 1903, that a limestone slab was discovered during the demolition of an old stone wall near the village of Kylver in the parish of Stånga, a slab that had been reused in that wall from an earlier context, its carved surface facing inward, hidden from view, preserved by the very concealment that had, until that moment, kept it unknown. When the slab was turned and its surface examined, what the finders saw stopped them immediately. Carved into the flat face of the limestone, in a series of lines that ran across the stone with deliberate order, was writing. Not the Latin alphabet, not any script associated with the historically documented cultures of medieval Scandinavia. Something older. Something that belonged to an earlier layer of the European world, to the period before Christianity, before the full integration of Northern Europe into the literate Mediterranean cultural sphere, before the runic writing systems of Scandinavia had evolved into the forms most familiar from Viking Age inscriptions. What was carved on the Kylver Stone was the Elder Futhark, the oldest known runic alphabet, in what is, to this day, one of its earliest and most complete surviving inscriptions. The Elder Futhark is a writing system of 24 characters that served as the primary runic alphabet of the Germanic-speaking peoples of Northern Europe, from roughly the 2nd century AD through the 8th century, when it gradually gave way to the simplified, younger Futhark of the Viking Age. Its origins are debated. Runic scholars have proposed derivation from various Mediterranean alphabets, most commonly the Latin or the Etruscan, transmitted northward through trade and cultural contact routes that connected the Roman world with the Germanic and Scandinavian peoples at its margins. Others have argued for a more independent development, noting features of the runic system that do not map cleanly onto any single Mediterranean source. The Kylver Stone inscription dates to approximately 400 AD, placing it in the migration period, that turbulent era of population movement, political reorganization, and cultural transformation that followed the decline of Roman imperial power in the West and reshaped the ethnic and linguistic map of Europe. It is one of the oldest surviving inscriptions in the Elder Futhark, and what it contains makes it uniquely significant within the runic corpus. The stone bears a complete sequence of all 24 runic characters of the Elder Futhark, carved in their traditional order, the sequence that gives the alphabet its name, derived from the phonetic values of the first 6 characters, F, U, Theth, A, R, K. This is called a Futhark inscription, and it is a rare and meaningful category of runic text. Writing out the full alphabet in sequence is not a neutral act of transcription or literacy demonstration. In the runic tradition, as in many ancient writing systems, the individual characters carried meaning and power that went beyond their phonetic function. Each rune was simultaneously a letter, a concept, and a force, connected, in the cosmological understanding of the Germanic peoples, to specific aspects of the natural and supernatural world. To write the full Futhark in sequence was, most runic scholars agree, an act of magical or ritual significance. It was a summoning of the complete power of the runic system, an invocation of the entire alphabet as a unit of protective or transformative force, rather than simply a tool of communication. The context in which the Kylver Stone was found supports that interpretation. The slab had been used as a cover stone for a burial, a grave from the migration period, sealed beneath the limestone with the inscribed face turned inward, toward the dead rather than outward toward the living. The full Futhark, carved on a stone placed over a grave, facing the deceased in the darkness of burial. This is not a literacy exercise. This is something else. A protection, perhaps. A sealing. A deployment of runic power in the service of whatever was understood to be at stake when a person died, and the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it was, briefly, dangerously open. Below the Futhark sequence, the Kylver Stone bears additional carved elements that have generated significant scholarly discussion, and whose meaning has not been definitively resolved. There is a further runic inscription, a word or name, possibly Suis, whose interpretation remains contested. And there is a tree-like symbol, a branching form that some researchers have identified as a variant of the runic character for the elm or yew tree, and that others have connected to the broader Scandinavian cosmological concept of Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology, whose roots and branches connected the 9 worlds of the Norse cosmos. Whether that connection is interpretively sound, or whether it imports too much from later and better documented mythological sources into an earlier and more ambiguous context, is a question that runic scholars continue to negotiate. What is beyond question is that the person or people who carved the Kylver Stone were operating within a rich and sophisticated symbolic tradition, one in which writing was not simply a technology of communication, but a technology of power, in which the arrangement of characters on a surface carried consequences in the world beyond the purely textual, and in which the relationship between the living and the dead was managed, in part, through the careful deployment of inscribed language. That understanding, of writing as force rather than merely record, is one that the modern world has largely set aside. We use writing to convey information, to document, to communicate across distance and time. We do not generally believe that carving particular symbols in a particular order on a stone placed over a grave will affect what happens to the person buried beneath it. The people who made the Kylver Stone believed otherwise, or at least they acted as if they did, which in the absence of any record of their inner states amounts to the same thing. What did they understand the runes to be capable of, carved in that complete sequence in the dark above the dead? And what did the dead receive in that sealed limestone silence from the full alphabet of a world they had just left?